Imagine a drone, like launched from the middle of New York City, flying completely undetected across the country. And it perfectly strikes a single specific building in Denver, Colorado.
Which is a distance of what, about 2,700 kilometers?
Exactly, 2,700 kilometers. And this week, the Ukrainian military did exactly that to a Russian oil refinery.
It's just wild to think about.
It really is. Welcome to this deep dive into the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting beneath the week of July 6th to July 12th, 2026.
We're taking you far beyond the daily headlines. Our mission is to piece together the structural changes happening right now.
Right, pulling from a massive stack of policy analyses, financial reports, and international dispatches. And the extremes we're exploring today are genuinely staggering.
Yeah, like unpacking how a sitting U.S. president generated a billion-dollar cryptocurrency windfall while in office.
Right, and we're going to look at the mechanics of how severe heat domes and catastrophic earthquakes are quite literally rewriting the defense strategies of entire nations.
So the defining theme of the data this week is really the total transformation of what constitutes a battlefield. The whole concept of two armies meeting at a geographic border is, well, it's dissolving in real time.
Dissolving completely.
Right. We're seeing warfare move rapidly from physical trenches to invisible, highly digitized realms that just bypass traditional defenses entirely.
And the situation in Europe perfectly captures that mutation. Look at the NATO summit in Ankara.
Yeah, that was intense.
It was. Donald Trump opened the summit by airing a very specific set of grievances, focusing heavily on Greenland and the ongoing conflict with Iran.
Though he did ultimately sign a collective defense communique.
He did. But while those diplomatic formalities were happening, the reality on the ground was brutally physical. A Russian ballistic missile strike on Kiev killed 58 people.
Which prompted the U.S. to take the unprecedented step of licensing Ukraine to manufacture their own Patriot missiles domestically.
Right, but the actual paradigm shift wasn't the Patriot missiles. It was that Ukrainian drone successfully striking Russia's largest oil refinery in Omsk, 2,700 kilometers away from the front lines. It's like a long-distance chess move.
That is a great way to put it. The mechanism of a strike like that changes the entire calculus of national defense. Traditionally, an invading force has to push a front line forward, kilometer by kilometer.
Dealing with infantry and tanks.
Exactly, and radar nets. But a long-range drone strike bypasses the entire theater of war. It flies under the radar architecture designed for ballistic missiles and directly hits the opponent's economic engine.
And the damage to the Omsk refinery was so severe that Vladimir Putin actually had to publicly acknowledge domestic fuel shortages.
Right, long lines at gas stations across Russia. And President Trump openly stated he supports Ukraine using these deep strikes inside Russia as a mechanism to end the war.
Because it completely circumvents the military to attack the society's capacity to function. But, if we were looking at technology bypassing physical defenses, we really have to look at the alarm bells ringing in the financial sector right now.
Oh, absolutely. The cybersecurity warnings.
Right. The European Central Bank just ordered 110 different banks to submit emergency security plans, specifically addressing, quote, frontier AI risks.
And the Bank of England is issuing severe warnings about AI-driven cyber attacks on global financial markets.
Meanwhile, OpenAI just released GPT 5.6 following a government-mandated security delay, and a previous ban on Anthropic's models was just lifted. So if frontier AI is advancing so rapidly that central banks are demanding emergency firewalls, aren't we looking at a new invisible front line in the financial sector that no physical missile system can defend against?
Yeah, we are looking at a total convergence of strategic logic here. Taking out a domestic fuel supply with a drone and taking out a central bank's liquidity routing with an autonomous AI model achieve the exact same goal.
Crippling a nation's infrastructure.
Exactly. The target is no longer the military. The target is the economy itself. An AI cyber attack that freezes interbank lending for 48 hours could cause way more structural damage to a nation than a conventional bombing campaign.
Wow.
Right. The defense perimeter for a modern nation-state now has to stretch from physical interceptor missiles in the sky to, algorithmic firewalls inside private banking servers.
So if the strategic logic in Europe and cyberspace is to bypass the military and target critical economic infrastructure, that exact same logic is playing out with brute force in the Middle East right now.
Specifically targeting the world's most critical energy choke points. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz has devolved from strategic posturing into direct kinetic destruction.
Iran attacked 3 commercial tankers in the strait, And in immediate response, President Trump revoked all remaining oil export waivers.
He officially declared the U.S.-Iran ceasefire memorandum of understanding completely dead.
Right, publicly referred to Iranian leadership as scum and ordered direct U.S. military strikes on Iranian defense systems.
And the fallout was instantaneous. Iran retaliated by striking targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar.
And this entire regional escalation is happening concurrently with a massive 6-day state funeral in Tehran for Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed back in February.
Right.
But the crucial detail here is that his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, who is the widely assumed successor, is completely missing.
He didn't even appear at his own father's state funeral.
Which is wild.
It is. A succession void of that magnitude occurring during a massive regional military escalation, it just acts as an accelerant for chaos.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When the apex of a command structure goes dark, the various factions beneath it, like the Revolutionary Guard, the intelligence apparatus, the regional proxy militias, they often begin acting autonomously to consolidate their own power.
And we are seeing the ripple effects of that decentralized chaos play out with those regional proxies. Hamas just announced they are formally dissolving their governing body in Gaza,
handing administrative power over to a UN-backed committee,
ostensibly to leverage a U.S.-brokered peace plan. But the mechanics of this move are incredibly complicated. Israel currently occupies 60 to 70% of the Gaza Strip, and Hamas provided absolutely zero timeline for disarming their militant wing.
None at all.
So it's like a Jenga tower, where 3 structural pieces are pulled out at the exact same time, with Mojtaba Khamenei missing in Iran and Hamas stepping down from governance in Gaza. Are we seeing a deliberate, coordinated strategy by these groups to create chaotic power vacuums to force international intervention? Or is the infrastructure of the organizations just sheerly collapsing under military pressure?
Honestly, it functions as a highly effective strategy regardless of the original intent. Let's examine the mechanics of the Hamas maneuver.
Okay.
It is essentially asymmetric warfare executed via bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy, how so?
Well, by offloading the day-to-day governance to a UN-backed committee while simultaneously refusing to give up their weapons, they are forcing the international community to take financial and logistical responsibility for a massive humanitarian crisis.
While preserving their own ability to wage insurgent attacks.
Exactly. And when you combine that manufactured vacuum in Gaza with the total collapse of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire and direct missile strikes flying across the Gulf, the conflict zone drastically widens.
Right.
A power vacuum draws multiple competing actors into the same space, which makes negotiating any kind of diplomatic off-ramp nearly impossible.
We are seeing these power structures fracture abroad, but the mechanics of power are shifting just as radically within the United States. Only domestically, it is the sheer volume and velocity of capital that is rewriting the rules of the political system.
The barrier between private digital wealth and public political power has essentially been erased this week.
The financial disclosures are just unprecedented. Official ethics reports reveal that President Trump has generated over $1.4 billion from cryptocurrency since returning to the Oval Office.
And we really need to look at exactly how this happened.
Right. A massive portion of this came from an entity called Celebration Coins, which was the algorithmic engine powering the Trump meme coin.
That coin generated $635 million in revenue for its creators before its value violently plummeted,
leaving nearly 1 million retail investors with an estimated $3.8 billion in collective losses.
And on top of that, another $526 million was generated through World Liberty Financial,
which is a decentralized crypto firm managed directly by the president's sons.
What we are analyzing here is the total capitalization of a sitting executive's political brand through decentralized finance. In traditional finance, generating $500 million requires, regulatory filings, underwriters, and physical assets.
So lots of red tape.
Exactly. But in the crypto space, a token can be minted, hyped, and liquidated for hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of days, completely bypassing traditional financial oversight.
And it isn't just digital currency. It is massive structural changes to how American wealth is distributed and managed. Look at the launch of the Trump accounts.
Right, the new federal scheme.
Yeah, it's a taxpayer-funded program that gives $1,000 in U.S. equities to every American baby born between 2025 and 2028. 6 million accounts have already been opened.
But the real structural shift is that these federal accounts are being buoyed by massive private philanthropy.
Like a single $6.3 billion pledge from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. And while billions are flowing into these new vehicles, the Supreme Court just fundamentally altered how money flows into elections.
In a 6-3 vote, the court lifted Watergate-era federal spending limits on party candidate coordination. It also upheld state bans on transgender athletes in female sports and upheld Mississippi's grace period for mail-in ballots.
And the mechanics of that campaign finance ruling are critical to understand. The Watergate-era limits were specifically designed to prevent a political party and a candidate's campaign from pooling unlimited funds to coordinate their strategy.
By lifting those limits, a national party can now act as a massive, unrestricted financial conduit directly into a specific candidate's operational campaign.
Which profoundly increases the velocity of money in our electoral system.
Absolutely.
So, looking at this strictly objectively, it's like the gamification of the American political economy. When you combine a sitting president generating over $1 billion through unregulated decentralized finance, a private foundation injecting $6 billion into a federal baby bond program, and the Supreme Court removing coordination limits on campaign spending, does this fundamentally rewrite the basic mechanics of how political power is funded and exercised in the United States?
Mechanically, it establishes an entirely new paradigm. We are witnessing the total convergence of deregulated private wealth and institutional political power.
Right.
When you remove the traditional friction from campaign finance, the sheer volume of capital dictates policy priorities. And you can see the intensity of this hyper-capitalized environment rippling all the way down to state-level governance and local races.
Where the stakes suddenly feel existential, you see that intensity everywhere this week. The Texas Board of Education just mandated that the King James Bible must be taught in all public schools by 2030.
And in Maine, the Democratic Senate nominee, Graham Plattner, was forced to withdraw after severe rape allegations.
Completely upending the mathematical battle for control of the Senate. Plus, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was targeted in a swatting hoax that was so severe it temporarily separated him from his infant twins.
And Representative Tom Keene had to publicly reveal that his 4-month absence from Congress was due to inpatient treatment for severe depression. The entire political ecosystem is hypercharged.
And that domestic ecosystem, where capital and attention are hyper-concentrated at the very top, is actually a perfect mirror for the structural shifts happening in the broader global economy right now.
Exactly. Let's look at the global markets, because the concentration of wealth in the technology sector is staggering.
SK Hynix, the South Korean semiconductor giant, just had a $28 billion NASDAQ debut.
That makes it the second largest debut ever, trailing only SpaceX.
And speaking of SpaceX, they were just added to the NASDAQ 100 less than a month after their IPO. Samsung just projected a record Q2 operating profit of $59 billion.
But this is where the market psychology gets really interesting. Despite those massive, record-breaking profit projections, shares for both Samsung and SK Hynix actually dropped.
Right. It's the defining anxiety of the AI era.
The capital expenditure required to build out the physical infrastructure for artificial intelligence, the data centers, the cooling systems, the semiconductor fabrication plants, it is astronomical.
Astronomical. And the market is looking at the sheer volume of billions being poured into this foundation and asking a very terrifying question. At what point does this technology actually generate enough real-world revenue to justify the cost?
It is the classic fear of an over-leveraged bubble.
And while the tech sector absorbs all the speculative capital, the traditional corporate world is aggressively consolidating to survive. Microsoft just slashed 3,200 jobs at Xbox.
Italy's Unicredit just aggressively upped its hostile stake in Germany's Commerzbank to nearly 48%.
You have Castle Lake acquiring EasyJet for £5.5 billion and Sky buying ITV Media and Entertainment for £1.6 billion. But the real vulnerability is at the sovereign level, isn't it?
Oh, without a doubt. Japan's 10-year bond yields just hit 2.9%. When your public debt exceeds 200% of your entire GDP, a 2.9% yield means the cost to simply service that debt threatens to swallow your entire national budget.
So if you want to understand the global economy right now, picture a centrifuge spinning at maximum speed. All the capital, the investment, and the growth are being forced to the very outer edges of frontier technology and aerospace.
That leaves a massive hollowing vacuum in the traditional middle-class core and in sovereign governments that rely on traditional economic growth.
It's like a runaway bullet train next to a deflating balloon. And as that economic core hollows out, we are seeing global democratic participation rapidly deflate. In Zimbabwe, the 83-year-old President Mnangagwa literally signed constitutional amendments abolishing direct elections entirely so he can stay in power past 2028.
In Algeria, the ruling party easily retained power, but the voter turnout was a miserable 21%.
In France, Marine Le Pen's conviction for misusing funds was upheld, but the courts strategically shortened her ban, clearing the way for her to run for the presidency next year.
And in the UK, Nigel Farage resigned his seat over a £5 million donation controversy, but he is running entirely unopposed in the resulting by-election.
So looking at this holistically, we're seeing astronomical profits in AI and chips, but investors are spooked. Is the global market heavily over-leveraged on the promise of an AI utopia while completely ignoring the massive red flags of political instability in places like Zimbabwe or the staggering debt in Japan?
The markets aren't ignoring it, they are entirely disconnected from it. I mean, a semiconductor firm doesn't need a robust democracy in Zimbabwe or high voter turnout in Algeria to hit its quarterly earnings.
Right, they just need power and materials.
Right. Exactly. But the danger of this extreme economic concentration is that when populations feel completely disconnected from the economic forces shaping their lives, democratic norms fragment. Uncontested races and 21% voter turnouts are the symptoms of a global electorate that feels entirely powerless against the sheer velocity of modern capital.
And if you, listening right now, are wondering how this massive concentration of capital in AI and aerospace affects you locally, you only have to look at the physical world this week. Because while the markets obsess over the future yields of artificial intelligence, the physical reality of the present is breaking down under the strain of climate disasters and infrastructure failures.
The juxtaposition between the digital wealth being generated and the physical destruction on the ground is probably the most critical dynamic of the week.
Let's look at the sheer scale of the physical crises. Venezuela was just hit by back-to-back 7.2 and 7.5 magnitude earthquakes. Over 3,500 people are confirmed dead, 60,000 structures have been damaged, and 6 million people are currently lacking basic, life-sustaining resources.
Over in Central Europe, a massive heat dome just shattered historical records. It hit 107.4 degrees Fahrenheit in the Czech Republic.
In Sri Lanka, they are fighting their worst dengue outbreak in years with 55,000 cases. The situation is so dire, they are deploying Air Force drones just to locate mosquito breeding grounds in standing water.
And we are seeing how these extreme environmental and infrastructural pressures operate as threat multipliers. They severely exacerbate existing human security crises.
The human toll is just devastating. In Sudan, the RSF, the paramilitary group fighting the National Army, has completely surrounded the city of El Obeid, trapping 500,000 civilians inside with dwindling supplies.
In Asia, Indian border guards reportedly deported 10,000 Bangladeshi and Rohingya Muslims into Bangladesh under the cover of darkness.
In the United States, an ICE agent fatally shot a Mexican national in Texas, which is the sixth such fatality just since January 2025.
And in Utah, the state permanently shut down Provo Canyon School due to rampant systemic abuse, which is a massive regulatory blow to a $23 billion troubled teen industry.
These physical breakdowns are forcing governments into massive geopolitical shifts. Cuba's power grid just collapsed again, and the infrastructure crisis is so severe that Raul Castro's grandson secretly expressed a willingness to open negotiations with the U.S.
Up north, Canada just announced a £52 billion deal to buy 12 German submarines specifically to protect its Arctic coast.
And you have China alarming the entire Pacific defense apparatus by launching a submarine-based ballistic missile 4,300 miles over the ocean.
Right. The military posturing never stops.
It doesn't. And amidst all this heavy geopolitical maneuvering, you have the bizarre oddity of FIFA overturning an automatic red card for U.S. soccer star Fuller and Balogun simply because President Trump personally intervened with the FIFA president.
The U.S. ended up losing to Belgium anyway, but the intervention highlights how personalized international leverage has become.
Exactly. But returning to the structural issue, it's such a jarring contrast. We have space companies instantly joining the NASDAQ 100, yet millions lack power in Cuba, and Europe is baking under a 107-degree heat dome. The AI servers powering the tech boom require massive amounts of electricity and cooling, while local power grids are buckling under severe heat.
It's completely unsustainable.
Right. Are these massive environmental and infrastructure failures going to force a complete rewiring of global alliances? Are things like Canada buying a dozen submarines or Cuba secretly negotiating with the U.S. proof that climate and infrastructure are now the primary drivers of national defense?
We have crossed a definitive threshold. Extreme natural events, melting ice caps, and resource scarcity can no longer be categorized merely as humanitarian issues to be handed off to NGOs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They are immediate hard power national security threats. Canada spending £52 billion on submarines isn't abstract military posturing. They are doing it because the Arctic ice is physically melting, which opens up entirely new, highly vulnerable maritime borders and creates fierce competition for previously trapped resources.
And Cuba, reaching out to the U.S., proves that ideological purity and historical grudges cannot survive a collapsed electrical grid.
Exactly. Governments are being forced to make desperate diplomatic and military pivots because it is impossible to defend the sovereignty of a nation if its physical foundation is collapsing beneath it.
Let's pull all of these threads together, because the sheer scale of the structural shifts this week is historic. We started by looking at a drone bypassing an entire theater of war to strike a target 2,700 kilometers away.
We unpack the mechanics of how billions of dollars in decentralized crypto wealth and deregulated campaign finance are rewriting how political power is acquired and exercised.
And we examine the severe anxiety of global markets over-leveraged on artificial intelligence, juxtaposed against a physical world suffering from catastrophic earthquakes, unprecedented heat domes, and collapsing power grids.
Everything we have discussed operates as a single interconnected system.
Yes, exactly.
A drone strike on a Russian refinery spikes energy markets, which fuels inflation, which forces central banks to hold rates high, which drastically alters how the billions needed for AI infrastructure are funded, which in turn demands more electricity from power grids that are currently failing under extreme heat.
And for you listening, that is exactly why we do this deep dive. Understanding these invisible mechanisms isn't just about catching up on the news. It is the only way to actually navigate a rapidly shifting world.
You really have to understand the structural changes beneath the surface to anticipate what happens next.
Absolutely. So we will leave you with this final thought. If AI and deep strike drones can entirely bypass traditional military front lines and decentralized digital wealth can entirely bypass traditional political funding and financial regulation, what happens to the very concept of the nation-state when the most powerful, world-shaping forces on Earth are borderless technologies and digital currencies?
It's a huge question.
It is. Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.
Imagine, for just a second, that you are forced into a really high-stakes trade.
Okay.
You have to spend $4 million to destroy a remote-controlled toy. And that toy costs your opponent, I don't know, maybe $7,000?
Right. It's an absurd proposition.
It is. Now, imagine having to make that exact same devastating financial trade 13,000 times in a single month. That is not some hypothetical war game scenario. That is exactly the brutal mathematical reality of how a modern superpower recently lost a war.
It really is.
So welcome to the deep dive. It is Sunday, July 12th, 2026. And look, if you're listening to this, you don't need me to tell you that the world feels exceptionally chaotic right now.
To put it mildly.
Right. The tectonic plates of global power are just shifting right under our feet. The old rules of who wins, who loses, and how we even measure strength, they just simply do not apply anymore.
No, they really don't.
Yeah.
We are living through this period where the fundamental architecture of geopolitics is being aggressively rewritten. I mean, how nations fight, how they trade, how they define themselves, all of it.
And our mission today for you listening is to cut through the daily noise of that 24-hour news cycle. We want to examine the structural, economic, and, historical forces that are driving this massive global reshuffle.
Exactly.
And to do that, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources curated by the Weekly Geopolitical Lens. We've got deep policy analyses, financial publications, columns from the New York Times, Washington Post, Time, and a bunch of leading international papers.
It's a huge stack of data today.
It is. We're going to explore how cheap drones completely paralyzed a military titan, why the 2026 World Cup is actually one of the most profound geopolitical mirrors we have right now.
That part is so fascinating.
It really is. And why the ultimate strategic advantage in the century isn't, a hypersonic missile. It's human talent. So, okay, let's unpack this. Starting with that $4 million trade I mentioned, we really have to talk about the recent U.S.-Iran war.
Yes. Operation Epic Fury. If you want to understand why our traditional metrics for measuring global power are completely broken, you have to look at Victor Meekin's column on this specific 39-day conflict.
Right.
Because on paper, by all 20th century standards, this should have been an overwhelming, decisive American victory.
So let's lay out the sheer scale of the firepower here. Over those 39 days, the United States launched more than 13,000 strikes.
Yeah.
They instituted this massive, devastating naval blockade.
Wow.
But the outcome? The Tehran regime survived.
Survived, and they didn't just barely scrape by. They retained 70% of their missile arsenal.
Wow.
And their nuclear stockpiles are intact. which led directly to the Trump administration signing the Versailles Memorandum in June 2026.
And that memorandum lifted the oil sanctions and freed up, what, $100 billion in Iranian assets?
Roughly $100 billion, yeah.
I'm looking at these numbers, and I'm genuinely struggling to comprehend the mechanism of failure here. How does a military with a nearly $1 trillion budget launch 13,000 strikes and walk away having to unfreeze the enemy's bank accounts?
Well, it comes down to a concept that Meeking calls the asymmetric economics of modern war.
Asymmetric economics, okay.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand that this wasn't a failure of American courage, right?
Yeah.
Or even necessarily the capability of the weapons themselves.
The missiles worked?
The weapons worked exactly as engineered.
Yeah.
This was a catastrophic failure of military accounting. You have to look at the brutal math of defense versus offense in 2026. Iran basically systematically deployed swarms of low-cost, off-the-shelf or domestically manufactured drones.
And we are talking about technology that costs anywhere from $7,000 to maybe $35,000 per unit, right?
Exactly. Pennies in military terms.
Okay, so I'm stuck on this phrase, asymmetric economics. When I hear asymmetric warfare, I usually think of, I don't know, guerrilla fighters hiding in mountains.
Right, the traditional insurgency model.
Yeah, not accountants balancing a spreadsheet. So how does economics actually win an air war?
Well, think about the physical encounter in the sky. You have a $7,000 drone flying toward a critical asset.
Right.
Maybe it's a $100 million radar installation.
Okay.
Or maybe it's a $1 billion naval destroyer. Or even just a barracks housing hundreds of personnel. You simply cannot afford to let that drone hit its target.
Right. The damage would be too catastrophic.
Exactly. So you have to intercept it.
Yeah.
And the United States' primary defensive mechanisms for these specific threats are systems like the Patriot missile batteries and THAAD interceptors.
I hear those acronyms constantly in the news right now. Let's
Yeah.
actually break them down for a second. What is the difference between a Patriot and a THAAD, and why are we using them on cheap drones?
Sure. So Patriot stands for Phased Array Tracking Radar to intercept on target.
Okay.
It's an incredibly sophisticated surface-to-air missile system. It's designed to shoot down high-performance aircraft and tactical ballistic missiles.
Right. And THAAD.
THAAD is the Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense System. It's designed to shoot down short, medium, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles right in their terminal phase. So right as they are diving toward their target.
Okay, so these are exquisite, highly engineered marvels of modern tech.
Exactly. And a single Patriot missile costs roughly $4 million. A THAAD interceptor costs even more than that. But when the sky is literally filled with a swarm of cheap drones, and those drones are threatening your vital infrastructure,
You don't have the luxury of choosing a cheaper bullet.
you don't. You have to fire the $4 million missile at the $7,000 drone.
So it's essentially just a forced economic bleed out. It's like playing a high-stakes game of chess, but your opponent's pawns cost absolute pennies, and they have the ability to instantly vaporize your $1 million queens.
That is a perfect analogy.
You can capture as many of their pawns as you want, but eventually you are going to run out of queens.
That is precisely the mechanism of attrition happening here. Over just 39 days, the U.S. critically drained its defense inventories. I mean, the data shows they expended roughly half of all Patriot missiles in existence.
Half of them in 39 days.
Yes. And somewhere between 50% to 80% of their global stockpile of dead interceptors.
Wait, 80% of the THAAD interceptors are just gone?
Gone.
Wow.
And you can't just 3D print a new THAAD interceptor over the weekend, you know. The supply chains for these weapons require specialized materials, rare earth minerals, and highly skilled labor. Restocking those systems will take years.
And cost billions upon billions of dollars.
Exactly, which suddenly leaves the U.S. dangerously exposed in other theaters around the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
And the sources highlight another terrifying detail about how the U.S. tried to manage this. Operation Epic Fury was apparently the first large-scale battlefield use of the Pentagon's Maven Smart system.
Right, the AI targeting system.
Yeah. Using artificial intelligence for real-time target generation. But the analysts note that this technological edge is already slipping away because China is replicating it through something called adversarial distillation.
Yeah, that is a huge point of concern.
Wait, adversarial distillation? What does that actually look like? Is that just a fancy cybersecurity term for hacking the Pentagon's code?
No, it's actually far more insidious than a traditional hack. You don't even need to steal the source code to replicate the AI.
How does that work?
Think of it like a master chef and an apprentice. The master chef, in this case, the U.S. military's multi-billion-dollar AI system, spends years and massive amounts of computational power learning how to identify a hidden missile silo from a really blurry satellite photo.
Okay, so it does the hard work.
Right. Adversarial distillation is when a rival power takes the outputs of that U.S. system and uses them to train their own, smaller, cheaping AI model.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Chinese system doesn't need to learn how to do the complex math from scratch. It just studies the American AI's final answers until it learns to mimic its behavior perfectly.
So they essentially bypass decades of expensive research and development.
Completely bypass it.
So if adversaries can essentially copy the trillion-dollar AI targeting systems for a fraction of the cost,
Yeah.
and they are overwhelming our air defenses with drones that cost less than a used car, isn't the U.S. military-industrial complex basically fighting a 21st century war with a deeply flawed 20th century business model?
Undeniably. I mean, a defense posture based on exquisite, hyper-expensive, slow-to-produce platforms simply cannot compete with mass-produced, cheap autonomous systems in a war of attrition.
It just doesn't scale.
Exactly.
Yep.
And critics from across the spectrum, analysts like Corey Shack and Yakov Kedmi, pointed out that Washington lacked strategic planning for this kind of grind.
Because the political leadership couldn't stomach the massive human casualties that would be required to physically occupy Iranian territory.
Right, like seizing Karg Island. They couldn't do it. So they relied entirely on an air war. But as we just established, an air war in 2026 is an economic black hole.
It really is, but I want to pause here for a second and look at the other side of this ledger. Because when we say Iran survived or even, won this exchange by securing the Versailles Memorandum,
Yeah.
winning in asymmetric warfare is a highly relative term.
Oh, it is incredibly loaded. Just look at the cost of that survival.
I mean, the sources outline over $270 billion in infrastructural devastation inside Iran. Power grids, water facilities, industrial centers, just obliterated.
Completely destroyed.
The livelihoods of 25 million Iranian citizens are now at severe immediate risk. They retain their regime and their missiles, sure, but they are ruling over a country in absolute ruins.
And this fundamentally redefines what victory actually means today. For a smaller or asymmetric power fighting a conventional titan, winning often just means bleeding the larger power until the political will in Washington or London collapses, and they just leave.
But the domestic toll of executing that strategy is just catastrophic.
It is. And this mutual devastation, this realization that conventional deterrence failed to prevent a war and asymmetric tactics resulted in national ruin, it is sending shockwaves through the entire region.
Which naturally forces us to look at the regional fallout. We have a brilliant analysis here by Ijaz Haider looking at the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC.
Yes, his piece is excellent.
Because the U.S.-Iran war ended with this Versailles Memorandum, Haider argues that the entire pre-war security architecture of the Gulf has effectively collapsed.
Wow.
The memorandum doesn't actually solve the decades of underlying hostility between Washington and Tehran.
No, it essentially just pauses the clock.
Exactly. It just kicks the can down the road and the Gulf states know it.
Right. And Haider points out that the GCC now faces a profound, almost existential strategic dilemma. They basically have three choices going forward.
Okay, what are they?
Option one, they continue treating Iran as a permanent enemy, which means risking getting caught in the crossfire of the next war.
Not ideal.
No. Option two, they attempt to build a totally new, inclusive regional security framework that actually brings Iran to the table.
Okay. And option three?
We're option three. They maintain their U.S. security ties while trying to remain strictly, fiercely neutral in any future conflict.
And Haider makes the case that the third option, strict neutrality, is really the most realistic, mostly because the GCC is, frankly, riddled with internal fractures.
Yes.
From the outside, it's really easy to view the Gulf states as this monolithic block of oil wealth, but the reality is so much messier.
We have to look at their history here.
Yeah.
The GCC was created in 1981, primarily as the defensive reaction to the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran.
Right, it was built on shared fear.
Exactly. But look at how they've operated internally. You had the Qatar diplomatic crisis from 2017 to 2021, where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain literally blockaded their own GCC neighbor.
Over political disagreement.
Yes. And you have the constant quiet rivalry between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi over regional economic dominance. Saudi Arabia naturally assumes it should be the dominant leader of the bloc, and the smaller states constantly maneuver to resist that hegemony.
Hayter makes a fascinating distinction in his piece between an alliance and true collective security.
That's a crucial point.
An alliance, like NATO, is designed specifically against an external enemy, right? It requires a dominant military power to anchor it. But collective security, the idea that members guarantee each other's safety regardless of who the aggressor is, even if the aggressor is internal, that requires deeply shared threat perceptions.
And a willingness to surrender a degree of national sovereignty,
Right.
which they do not want to do.
Right. And the Gulf fails almost every single requirement for collective security.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey are all locked in this complex competition for influence.
Their threat perceptions are totally misaligned. What keeps a policymaker awake in Riyadh is very different from what terrifies a leader in Doha. And most importantly, any proposed security framework generated by the Gulf traditionally excludes Iran. If you are systematically excluding a major regional power from your framework, you aren't building collective security. You are just building an anti-Iran alliance.
And as Hayter notes, historically, excluding Iran is a guaranteed recipe for continued instability.
Absolutely.
Which is forcing these nations to perform some incredible diplomatic acrobatics right now. Let's look at Saudi Arabia's Red Sea tightrope.
Yeah, Mohammed Osman wrote a fantastic piece detailing this.
Detailing how Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is trying to balance this shifting landscape. And it all centers around their Vision 2030 mega projects, specifically NEOM, this massive, futuristic, trillion-dollar city they're building in the desert.
Because capital is fundamentally cowardly. It hates risk.
Oh, for sure.
You cannot attract trillions of dollars in foreign direct investment to build a utopian smart city if there is a realistic chance that stray ballistic missiles might fly over the skyline.
Exactly. So to protect NEOM, Saudi Arabia is currently balancing a highly fragile détente with Iran. But simultaneously, they are formally entering the BRICS economic bloc, aligning closer with China and Russia.
Right.
And crucially, they are actively refusing to participate in U.S. military strikes against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They are desperately trying to be everyone's friend, or at least avoid being anyone's direct target.
It's a delicate balance. But the strategic geometry around them just keeps getting more complicated. Look at the Red Sea choke points.
Okay.
Israel recently recognized Somaliland. Why? To secure a strategic military and intelligence foothold near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet.
Wow.
This foothold allows Israeli intelligence to monitor the Red Sea and track weapons shipments. In a purely pragmatic sense, this actually helps Saudi Arabia by suppressing Houthi aggression and securing those shipping lanes.
What politically?
Politically, Riyadh has to quietly balance those concrete security benefits against its public ideological commitment to Arab and Islamic solidarity against Israel.
It is like a three-dimensional game of Jenga, where pulling out a single block in Yemen threatens to collapse a trillion-dollar tech city in Saudi Arabia.
It really is.
And we can't fully grasp this regional balancing act without bringing Pakistan into the picture. Hayter traces Pakistan's role all the way back to the era of the Shah of Iran. This is fascinating context.
It's history that most people forget.
Back in the 1950s and 60s, Iran was actually the first country to diplomatically recognize the newly formed state of Pakistan. They were both anchored in the Western anti-Soviet alliance system. At one point, the Shah even proposed a formal Pakistan-Iran confederation.
Yeah, it's a piece of history that is almost entirely forgotten today. But the 1979 Islamic Revolution changed the entire calculus. Suddenly, Pakistan had to navigate deep ideological differences, rising sectarian tensions, and the brutal proxy conflicts that played out next door in Afghanistan. Yet, despite all of those massive friction points, Pakistan has consistently strained to maintain ties. They quietly supported Iran during the devastating Iran-Iraq War, and their intelligence services have maintained back channels.
So fast forward to 2026, and Pakistan is essentially forced into a posture of aggressive neutrality. They desperately need strong economic relations with the wealthy GCC states, they need peaceful borders with Iran, and they absolutely refuse to be drafted into any kind of Sunni exclusionary alliance against Tehran.
They are trying to thread the needle as a regional mediator, because if the Gulf fully fractures and an all-out regional war erupts, the fallout on Pakistan's western border in terms of refugees, cross-border militancy, and economic shock would be disastrous.
Yeah.
What we are seeing across the board, from the war rooms in Washington to the palaces in Riyadh to the parliament in Islamabad, is a profound realization that the old architecture of military containment in the Middle East has reached its absolute physical and economic limits. It is broken.
But when a geopolitical structure breaks, nature abhors a vacuum. Something has to replace it. And our sources show that regional leaders and analysts are floating some genuinely radical new diplomatic architectures right now.
They are. The status quo is so untenable that ideas considered political suicide just a decade ago are now being debated openly. And we have to start with Rahm Emanuel's proposal.
Yes, Emmanuel's 23-state alternative. The core of his argument is that the traditional two-state solution, where American diplomats try to broker a bilateral peace treaty between just the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership, is functionally dead.
That's his starting premise, yes.
He argues that under Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel has become increasingly diplomatically isolated, aligning with extreme far-right elements that make a bilateral agreement impossible. And from a strictly American geopolitical perspective, Emmanuel argues this continuous cycle of conflict no longer serves U.S. strategic interests.
So he proposes what he calls a grand bargain. The mathematical structure is simple, but the political execution is mind-bogglingly complex. The proposal demands the creation of a new sovereign Palestinian state. In direct exchange for that, all 21 member nations of the Arab League, stretching from the Levant down to the Arabian Peninsula and across North Africa, would establish full, formal, normalized diplomatic relations with Israel.
So you have the 21 Arab states plus the new Palestinian state plus Israel, the 23-state solution.
Exactly.
The actual mechanism that makes this different, though, is the concept of regional accountability. Emmanuel is arguing that the international community can't just mandate a Palestinian state and leave Israel to figure out how to trust a new government right next door. He wants to socialize the risk.
Yes.
He argues the Arab League wealthy nations like Saudi Arabia, alongside Egypt and Jordan, must be legally and financially obligated to actively nurture, fund, and police this new Palestinian entity.
It's a massive paradigm shift. It takes the burden of state building and security away from just Jerusalem or Ramallah and spreads it across the entire Arab world.
I have to push back on the realism of this, though. Look at the sources we literally just discussed. We just spent 20 minutes outlining how fractured the GCC is. We talked about how these nations prioritize their own domestic mega-projects and national sovereignty above all else.
Yeah, they do.
Isn't a 23-state solution essentially just the old 2002 Arab Peace Initiative repackaged with a shiny new name? What actual tangible leverage compels 21 incredibly diverse states, many of whom, like Sudan, Syria, or Lebanon, are dealing with their own catastrophic internal crises, to take on the massive burden of actively managing and funding a fragile Palestinian government?
You are entirely right to be deeply skeptical. It is a highly ambitious, borderline utopian framework, but the leverage Emmanuel envisions to force this through isn't shared morality, it's sheer, overwhelming economic integration.
Okay.
He ties this entire proposal to the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMS.
Oh.
The theory is that the financial incentive of establishing a massive, streamlined trade route that deliberately bypasses corridors controlled by Russia, China, and Iran will generate so much wealth that these 21 nations will swallow the bitter political pill of having to police a Palestinian state.
Wow. Transactional peace. You bribe everyone with enough infrastructure and trade volume that going back to war basically becomes a bad business decision.
Precisely. But there is another framework discussed in our sources that attacks this problem from the exact opposite direction.
Oh.
Instead of top-down macroeconomic leverage, it focuses on bottom-up psychological reconciliation.
You're talking about the joint Israeli-Palestinian initiative known as a Land for All. They are advocating for a confederacy model.
It is a profound, fundamental reimagining of how the land itself is governed.
How does it work?
Under their confederacy model, you eliminate the concept of a hard, heavily militarized border splitting the territory into isolated camps. Israel and Palestine would exist as two entirely distinct political entities. They have their own states, their own parliaments, their own laws, but there would be an overarching framework that allows for the free movement of citizens across shared borders.
So, separation of governance, but openness of movement.
Exactly. That's the guiding principle.
Which, given the sheer scale of the bloodshed and trauma right now, sounds physically impossible. But the organizers of this initiative make a really compelling point. They argue that drawing the physical borders on a map isn't actually the hardest part. The impossible part is the psychological shift required to make those borders mean anything.
Yeah.
They argue that for peace to hold, Palestinians must comprehensively acknowledge the collective history, the deep-seated intergenerational trauma, and the profound psychological fears of the Jewish people. Not as a way to excuse or legitimize the actions of the Israeli military, but to actually understand the survival instinct driving the conflict.
And the requirement is reciprocal. They argue Israeli Jews must fundamentally shift their national narrative. They have to move away from denying or minimizing the mass displacement and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948.
They have to acknowledge their historical role in those injustices.
Yes, the core thesis here is that a treaty signed on a piece of paper by politicians in Washington means absolutely nothing if the two populations on the ground haven't reconciled with each other's historical trauma.
I was really struck by the historical precedent they use to back this up in the sources. They point to the relationship between France and Germany post-World War II. Think about the history there.
Oh, centuries of absolute industrialized bloodshed, millions upon millions of people dead.
Yet today, a French citizen can literally just drive across the border into Germany to buy groceries without even showing a passport.
And we have to remember how that European peace was engineered. It wasn't driven by a sudden magical realization of brotherly love.
Right.
It was driven by cold, calculated mechanics. The European coal and steel community integrated their vital war-making industries so deeply that going to war against each other became physically and economically impossible. They intertwined their supply chains until they were forced to get along.
There is a quote from the executive director of the A Land for All initiative, Rula Hardal, that serves as a really poignant anchor for this part of our discussion. She stated that she is willing to wait 50 years for a lasting, peaceful confederacy arrangement to fully develop. But, she said, the region simply cannot afford to let the current cycle of violence continue for another 50 years.
That is the ticking clock hanging over everything. Because as these regional conflicts drag on, as drones deplete missile stockpiles and shipping lanes are threatened, they don't stay neatly contained in the Middle East.
No.
They're bleeding directly into the broader global power structures. Which brings us to how these shifting realities are violently tearing at the fabric of the Western alliance itself.
Let's shift our focus to the 2026 NATO summit in Ankara. Because the massive economic strain of the Middle East, compounded by the grinding reality of the war in Ukraine, is all converging on NATO's doorstep. And the atmosphere at this Ankara summit is incredibly tense.
To say the least.
The U.S., under the Trump administration, is issuing an unprecedented demand. They want European allies to hit a staggering 5% of their GDP for defense spending.
We really need to contextualize just how massive a shift that is. For years, the agreed-upon target for NATO members was 2% of GDP, and many major European economies, like Germany, chronically failed to hit even that.
Yeah.
Moving from 2% to 5% isn't just a policy tweak. It requires a generational restructuring of a national budget. You're pulling billions of euros out of healthcare, infrastructure, and education and pouring it directly into military procurement.
And this demand isn't a polite suggestion. It comes with open, explicit threats from Washington about drastically drawing down U.S. troops stationed in Europe if the allies don't comply. President Trump has repeatedly referred to NATO as a paper tiger, and the U.S. Defense Secretary has already initiated formal reviews for potential troop withdrawals.
So Europe is essentially in a state of panic, scrambling to preempt an American abandonment.
And you can see that panic reflected in the massive spending deals being announced right before the summit. It is a highly coordinated show of financial force. Denmark, for instance, is announcing 3 billion euros in defense deals.
Yeah, that's huge for them.
This includes advanced air defense integration with Belgium and a major naval ship agreement with Britain. They are also purchasing a fleet of Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft specifically to monitor Greenland.
So, pause on that for a second. Why is monitoring Greenland suddenly a 3 billion euro priority for Denmark?
I was wondering that too.
It's the intersection of climate change and great power competition. As the Arctic ice caps melt, brand new maritime shipping routes are opening up, which drastically cuts the transit time between Asia and Europe.
Right, the new northern passages.
But more importantly, the melting ice gives Russian nuclear submarines unprecedented access to the North Atlantic. The P-8A Poseidon is a highly advanced sub-hunting aircraft. Denmark is buying them because the Arctic is rapidly becoming a contested, militarized zone, and they have to secure the high north if the U.S. isn't going to do it for them.
Wow. We are also seeing a massive push for U.S.-Europe co-production of munitions. They are setting up manufacturing facilities right on European soil to build Patriot PAC-3 missiles and AMRAAMs.
Right. And for those keeping track of the acronyms, AMRAAM is the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile, essentially the primary weapon fighter jets use to shoot down other planes beyond visual range.
Sweden is also stepping up, replacing the aging fleet of U.S.-built AWACS, those planes you see with the massive radar dishes on top that act as flying command centers, with their own domestically produced Saab Globalized system.
Interestingly, Rahm Emanuel actually weighed in on this NATO dynamic as well. He proposed a fundamental shift in how the alliance operates. He calls it a move from traditional defense to collective deterrence.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
His argument is that the U.S. needs to stop underwriting Europe's basic conventional defense. Instead, he proposes a strict division of labor. Europe buys the tanks, the artillery, and funds the ground troops, and they physically move those mobile assets east of the Rhine River, deploying them right up against the borders of the Baltics and the former Warsaw Pact states.
While the U.S. does what?
Meanwhile, the U.S. acts as a strategic tripwire, providing only the specialized high-end capabilities that Europe lacks, things like advanced offensive cyber warfare capabilities and space-based satellite tracking.
It sounds incredibly logical on paper, a clean division of labor. But this is where the sources highlight a massive, glaring contradiction in Europe's grand strategy. David Broder wrote a piece dissecting Europe's internal state, and it is a fascinating read.
It is.
Externally, at the NATO summit, Europe looks like it is coming together. They are writing massive checks, integrating their command structures, and talking tough. But internally, socially and economically, Europe is cracking up.
Broder uses the term polycrisis to describe what is happening.
Polycrisis.
Yeah, it is this overwhelming simultaneous convergence of structural failures. Crippling energy inflation, rapidly aging demographics, shrinking the tax base, stagnant wages, and strained public health services. And all of this is compounded by the long-term scarring from the 2008 financial crisis and the massive debts incurred during the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Initially, Europe actually tried to spend its way out of this polycrisis. They launched the Next Generation EU Fund. This was a historic €800 billion financial package meant to rebuild the European social contract.
Right.
The money was supposed to be dedicated to green industrialization, modernizing infrastructure, and digital transformation.
But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the entire trajectory of the continent was violently altered. That €800 billion, along with the political will and industrial capacity of the continent, shifted almost overnight from building green energy grids and schools straight into pure industrial-scale rearmament.
Okay, here is where I see what looks like the strategic trap of the century. European leaders, particularly in France, are constantly giving speeches about strategic autonomy. They want Europe to be a truly independent third pole of power, separate from the US and Russia.
Yes, that's the rhetoric.
But aren't they essentially just trapping themselves in a new kind of subservience? Following the invasion, they cut themselves off from cheap Russian pipeline gas, which is completely understandable politically. But now they are substituting that old dependency on cheap Russian gas for a brand new dependency on hyper-expensive American liquefied natural gas. And at the exact same time, to hit these 5% NATO targets, they are buying tens of billions of dollars in American defense tech. That doesn't look like autonomy to me. That looks like becoming a highly indebted captive customer to the American economy.
You've just articulated the exact core of Broder's critique. True strategic independence requires profound economic resilience and affordable energy to power your domestic industries. Military investment building artillery shell factories and buying Patriot missiles is necessary for survival, but it is economically sterile.
What do you mean by economically sterile?
Well, a new missile factory does not lower a German factory worker's monthly energy bill. It does not solve the inflation at the grocery store. It doesn't build affordable housing.
And the citizens are feeling that disconnect every single day.
Absolutely. The economic frustration of funding a massive continent-wide war machine while your own domestic quality of life plummets is a highly volatile mix. And it is directly fueling unprecedented political instability.
Because voters don't care about the intricacies of collective deterrence if they can't afford their heating bills.
Exactly. We are seeing the explosive rise of far-right, nationalist, and populist parties across the entire continent as a direct result. You have Vox surging in Spain, the AfD gaining terrifying ground in Germany, Marine Le Pen's faction dominating rural France, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands.
The traditional, centrist, liberal consensus that built the European Union is collapsing under the sheer weight of this polycrisis.
It's crumbling.
But that economic frustration in Europe doesn't just stop at the grocery store or the border. It is bleeding directly into the ballot box, which brings us to a terrifying statistic about the survival of democracy itself.
Yeah, this part is grim.
A nation's foreign policy, its ability to project power, honor treaties, or sustain an alliance, is only as strong as its domestic political stability. And right now, domestic stability is arguably the rarest commodity on Earth.
Let's look at the date for a moment. July 4, 2026. This is the sesquicentennial, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States.
A date that should be a triumph of the democratic model.
Yet, according to the analysts in our sources, it feels significantly less like a celebration and much more like a wake. The data provided by VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, is chilling. As of 2025, they estimate that only 7% of the global population currently lives in a functional liberal democracy.
7%. That is down from roughly 17% just 2 decades ago.
The retreat of democratic governance is staggering, and our sources urge us to look past the individual politicians to understand the deep structural threats driving this collapse. It's not just a matter of bad campaigns or unpopular candidates. The system itself is degrading.
What are those structural threats?
First, you have the profound digital balkanization of the media landscape. We no longer share a common set of foundational facts. If citizens are living in entirely different informational realities, the concept of shared citizenship, of debating policy based on mutual reality fractures completely.
Right, we can't even agree on what the problems are, let alone the solutions.
Exactly. Second, you have the unchecked rise of plutocracy. The top 0.0001% of the global population now holds historic, unprecedented levels of wealth. They exercise massive dark money influence over the political process while largely abandoning the civic virtue and tax burdens that historically sustained healthy democratic republics.
But the most terrifying structural threat mentioned in these economic sources comes from the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence. And this ties right back to our earlier discussion on the polycrisis.
It does.
The Bank for International Settlements recently circulated a paper suggesting that as AI continues to automate not just physical labor, but cognitive labor, it could drastically reduce human labor's share of total economic income down to as little as 20%.
We really need to pause and think about the mechanics of what that means for a society. Currently, the majority of wealth generated in a nation goes to the people doing the work, wages, salaries, benefits. If capital, meaning the massive tech corporations that own the AI models, the server farms, and the intellectual property, captures 80% of all income generated in the economy, the middle class mathematically ceases to exist.
Wow.
And as Aristotle noted thousands of years ago, a stable democracy relies entirely on political equality, which in turn requires a large, prosperous middle class to act as a stabilizing buffer between the ultra-rich and the desperate poor.
Without that middle class, you inevitably revert to a neo-feudal structure. A tiny elite controls the algorithms and the vast majority of the wealth, and everyone else is essentially reduced to the status of a digital serf, dependent on universal basic income or gig work scraps.
In that environment of intense, grinding economic anxiety, the political center simply cannot hold. People get desperate, and our sources dive incredibly deep into how this environment breeds the rise of ideological extremes.
And looking at the author's analysis, it's fascinating how they compare the mechanics of both extreme ends of the spectrum. They argue that whether you are looking at the populist right or the democratic socialists on the left, both are essentially utilizing the exact same tactics of a political insurgency against a failing establishment.
It is a brilliant structural comparison. The author draws a direct mechanical parallel between the rise of the progressive left within the Democratic Party today and the hostile takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump back in 2016.
So let's break down how an insurgency actually operates. Mainstream, moderate politicians run on platforms of incremental progress. They offer stability, predictability, respect for institutions, and the promise of bipartisan compromise.
Which, in a poli-sci textbook, sounds like exactly what you want in a leader.
Right, a steady hand on the wheel.
But in an era of polycrisis, where the working class feels the entire system is fundamentally rigged by that plutocracy we just mentioned, the promise of incremental progress feels like an insult.
It's like offering a Band-Aid for a bullet wound.
Exactly. Progressive candidates, much like populist right-wing candidates, offer something entirely different. They offer absolute moral certainty. They offer raw, unfiltered authenticity. They don't promise to tweak the tax code by a percent or two. They promise utopian transformations. They promise to tear down the corrupt structures and rebuild them entirely.
It sounds like mainstream establishment politicians are trying to fight a conventional uniformed war against a highly adaptable guerrilla insurgency. The establishment keeps relying on old metrics. They look at a progressive or populist candidate and assume they are unelectable in a general election because they poll poorly with moderate, college-educated suburbanites.
Right.
But that is the exact same catastrophic miscalculation the Republican establishment made in 2016. They assumed Donald Trump was statistically unelectable right up until the moment he took the oath of office.
Because authenticity, anger, and a willingness to aggressively fight the establishment often generate a level of grassroots voter enthusiasm and turnout that completely defies traditional, polite polling models. However, the author of this particular piece also levels severe structural critiques at the progressive left's platform, warning that mainstream Democrats must confront these extremes if they want to govern effectively.
Right. The piece points out very specific structural criticisms of the economic policies championed by democratic socialists. For example, it cites the historical failure of sweeping wealth taxes.
Yeah, that's a key example.
When implemented in countries like France, the data showed they consistently failed to generate the promised revenue, discouraged domestic economic growth, and led to massive capital flight as the wealthy simply moved their assets across the border. The piece also highlights deep controversies over foreign policy rhetoric.
Specifically criticizing parts of the progressive movement for their language regarding Israel and Palestine, arguing that anti-Israel activism frequently crosses the line into anti-Semitism or ends up excusing extremism.
And the core analytical takeaway of the piece is that if mainstream moderates fail to vigorously defend the mechanics of pragmatic liberalism and refuse to confront their own ideological extremes out of fear of primary challenges, the entire party will be fundamentally and permanently reshaped, just as the Republican Party was.
And the broader takeaway for our global analysis today is this. When leading democracies balkanize into these hostile, uncompromising ideological camps, their ability to project a coherent, reliable foreign policy is severely compromised.
How can the U.S. guarantee the security of Europe or the Middle East for the next decade if it violently swings between isolationist populism and utopian socialism every 4 years?
It can't. It's impossible for allies to rely on that.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If military might is draining our national treasuries and our democracies are fraying internally under the weight of AI and polarization, how on earth do nations ensure their long-term survival and prosperity in the 21st century?
This is where the data points to a surprising and frequently overlooked arena. The ultimate engine of national survival isn't the size of your military. It is demographics.
Demographics.
Yes, it is progressive immigration policy, aggressive global talent acquisition, and how intelligently a country allocates its capital.
Let's dive into the economic engine of all this. To show what actually works and what definitively doesn't, we have an incredible contrast in our sources. We are going to look at the financial architecture of Pakistan and then immediately contrast it with the current economic reality of Spain.
This is a really stark comparison.
Let's start with Pakistan's stock exchange, the PSX, as of July 2026. The data presented here is a masterclass in the catastrophic misallocation of national capital. Just 5 banks account for over 43% of the top 10 companies' total market capitalization. We are talking about over 3.3 trillion Pakistani rupees concentrated entirely in the financial sector.
And you have to ask the mechanical question. How are these specific banks generating such massive record-breaking profits? Are they funding innovative new tech startups? Are they lending money to build massive new manufacturing plants to employ the youth? No. They are earning these massive profits almost entirely off government debt.
How does that work?
The mechanism is simple. The central bank keeps interest rates punishingly high. These commercial banks take in remittances and savings as low-cost deposits from citizens, and then they lend that exact same money straight back to the cash-strapped government at a massive premium. It is a risk-free, highly lucrative cycle for the banks and economic poison for the country.
The statistic that completely blew my mind is the advance to deposit ratio, the ADR. It is currently sitting at a dismal 39.8%.
We really need to explain why that specific metric matters so much.
Yeah, please do.
The ADR basically measures how much of the money deposited in a bank is actually being deployed into the real economy. Let's make this real for the listener. Imagine a scenario in Lahore. You and your neighbors deposit $100 of your hard-earned savings into a local bank. An ADR of 39.8% means the bank is only lending out roughly 39 of those dollars to the local bakery trying to expand, or the mechanic trying to buy a new garage. The other $61 are just being hoarded by the bank to buy high-yield government treasury bills.
It's essentially a vampire squid on the local economy. And what happens when capital is hoarded like that? The real physical economy hollows out.
Yes.
Look at the data on Pakistan's agriculture. The sources note that domestic cotton yields are literally halving. The land has the potential to produce 8 to 10 million bales of cotton, but they are only currently producing 5 to 5.5 million. Why?
Because a farmer simply cannot get affordable credit from these banks to modernize their irrigation, buy resilient seeds to fight climate challenges, or purchase pesticides to deal with massive pest attacks.
And when the cotton crop fails, the entire textile industry starves. Factories shut down, national exports drop, and the currency devalues further.
It is a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. But what is truly fascinating here is that despite the structural starvation of capital, there is one massive, undeniable bright spot in Pakistan's economy, the IT sector.
Yes, IT and IT-enabled services exports just reached $3.8 billion for the fiscal year. That is a massive 19% year-on-year growth.
And ask yourself, why is IT succeeding while agriculture and manufacturing are collapsing?
Why?
Because the IT sector doesn't rely on massive capital-intensive bank loans to buy heavy machinery or land. It relies purely on human capital, on knowledge, on a young guy with a laptop writing code for a client in London. It proves that when you leverage human talent, even in an incredibly credit-starved, structurally dysfunctional environment, you can generate explosive economic growth.
Now, hold that thought about the sheer power of human capital, and let's swing the lens over to Europe. Let's look at Spain, because Spain just officially entered the $2 trillion GDP club, officially surpassing South Korea in aggregate economic size.
Spain's economic growth is currently radically outperforming all of its G7 peers. And unlike their artificial growth spurt in the early 2000s, which was built entirely on a highly unsustainable speculative property bubble that eventually crashed, this current growth is diversified. They're growing in agri-foods, automotive manufacturing, tourism, and massive green energy investments.
But the real driver, and this is the absolute crux of the matter regarding global power, is population growth fueled entirely by progressive immigration policies.
Yeah.
Spain's population just hit nearly 50 million people.
Yes.
The government instituted a policy of mass regularization for undocumented immigrants, bringing them out of the shadow economy and into the formal tax base. And get this statistic. 80% of Spain's total job growth since 2022 is attributed directly to foreign-born hires, largely migrating from Latin America.
They recognize their own demographic decline, and they're essentially importing their economic engine. Now, to be analytically rigorous, our sources note this isn't a flawless miracle. There are severe structural lags. Spain currently has the physical infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, the water systems, designed for a population of 40 million. But they're suddenly housing 50 million. Public investment is lagging dangerously behind population growth.
The housing market in major cities is severely strained, driving up rent.
Furthermore, while their aggregate GDP is massive, their actual GDP per capita and their labor productivity per hour still lag significantly behind Northern European industrial powerhouses like Germany or the Netherlands.
And politically, as we touched on earlier, the friction of this rapid demographic change is directly fueling the rise of the right-wing party Vox.
True. But strictly from a macroeconomic aggregate GDP perspective, immigration is the undeniable steroid driving their economy past nations like South Korea, which is currently facing a catastrophic demographic collapse.
Which brings us perfectly to Robert Hormat's brilliant piece published in Time magazine. He writes extensively about America's eclipsing advantage in the world. We've spent a large portion of this deep dive talking about Patriot missiles, drones, and aircraft carriers. But Hormats argues that America's greatest historical advantage was never actually its military-industrial complex.
Right.
It was its unique ability to attract, assimilate, and empower the world's most talented, ambitious immigrants.
He anchors his argument by citing Lee Kuan Yew, the legendary, highly pragmatic former Prime Minister of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was a master at observing great power dynamics. He once argued that America was not in inevitable decline because it possessed a unique, almost magnetic pull for the world's best scientists, engineers, doctors, and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He noted that a bright student in India or Brazil didn't dream of moving to Beijing. They dreamed of Silicon Valley. He warned that China, despite its massive population, historically lacked this ability. China has incredible domestic talent, but their closed society historically struggled to attract and integrate foreign innovators.
But Lee Kuan Yew also offered a very stark warning to Washington. He said that if the United States ever succumbed to nativism, if they actively restricted legal immigration, if they made it harder for brilliant minds to get H-1B visas or green cards, China would aggressively step in and close that strategic gap.
And that is exactly what the data in 2026 is showing us in real time. The legal immigration system in the U.S. has become increasingly draconian, backlogged, and uncertain. So what is the logical result? The smartest minds in the world, the foreign graduates who earn PhDs in artificial intelligence from MIT and Stanford, are unable to secure visas to stay, so they return home.
And many of them are returning directly to China. We are literally utilizing our world-class university system to educate the talent that is directly fueling America's greatest strategic rival in AI, in quantum computing, and in advanced manufacturing.
It's an incredible unforced error.
Hormats points out a fact that often gets lost in the political rhetoric. Immigrants founded NVIDIA. Immigrants founded Google. Nearly half of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. Restricting highly skilled immigration isn't protecting American jobs. It is actively starring the economic engine that creates the industries of the future.
It is a profound, self-inflicted strategic wound. In a great power competition, the nation that hoards the most global talent wins the century. It is that simple.
And honestly, nothing illustrates the fluid, complex reality of modern talent, migration, and national identity quite like our next source, the 2026 World Cup.
It really is the perfect geopolitical mirror for everything we've just discussed.
It's fascinating. We traditionally think of the World Cup as this pure, unadulterated clash of distinct national identities. France versus Argentina, the U.S. versus England, a test of pure domestic strength.
Right, blood and soil.
But the demographic reality of these rosters completely shatters the illusion of a fixed, simple, blood and soil national identity. Let's look at the data. On the Moroccan national team, 19 out of their 26 players were born outside of Morocco, largely in European diaspora communities.
No.
Over half of the United States men's national team holds dual citizenship. The racial and ethnic composition of the major European teams, France, England, Belgium, is inextricably linked to their historical colonial empires and modern migration pipelines.
The game is fully globalized. But the author of this piece also highlights a much darker sociological dynamic at play, what they term conditional acceptance.
Yeah, this was a tough read.
It's the reality of modern nationalism. Minority players, often the children of first-generation immigrants, are widely celebrated as national heroes when they score the winning goal. They are embraced by the media and the politicians as the shining true face of a modern integrated nation.
But the very moment they miss a crucial penalty kick or the team gets eliminated, that illusion of integration shatters instantly.
Exactly. The article specifically details the horrific experiences of Black Dutch players and Black English players in previous tournaments who faced immediate, organized, online racist abuse. They were suddenly and violently treated as foreign outsiders the moment they failed on the pitch. It shows how incredibly fragile and transactional this multicultural national identity really is for minorities.
And here's where it gets deeply paradoxical, especially looking at the political climate in the United States and Europe in 2026. The World Cup exposes a massive, glaring cognitive disconnect in the electorate.
Oh, absolutely.
If the economic data clearly shows that immigration builds trillion-dollar tech empires like Google, and the sports data clearly shows that immigration and diverse academies build World Cup-winning soccer teams, why is the political gravity in the West pulling so aggressively toward nationalism, closed borders, and mass deportation?
It's a huge contradiction.
The article points out this surreal, almost absurd contrast of fiercely nationalist fans, people who actively vote for politicians promising mass deportations and travel bans, screaming their lungs out in a pub, waving a flag in support of a highly diverse, multicultural, dual-citizen national soccer team.
It is cognitive dissonance on a staggering national scale. The electorate wants the fruits of a dynamic, globalized society. They want the cutting-edge tech, the explosive economic growth of a place like Spain, and the winning sports teams. But they are deeply, viscerally uncomfortable with the actual demographic and cultural changes required to produce those results.
I want the vibrant 21st century economy, but they want it with the homogenous 1950s demographics.
And the brutal reality of global economics is that you simply cannot have both. You have to choose.
Which perfectly sets up the conclusion of our deep dive, because the global winners of the next century will unequivocally be the nations that choose to adapt. They adapt their military procurement to the reality of cheap drones, they adapt their economies to the disruption of AI, and they adapt their national identities to attract and include global talent.
Right.
But to see exactly what happens to a great power that utterly refuses to adapt, a power that tries to force the world backward into the 19th century by brute force, we only have to look at Russia.
Let's examine the intelligence summaries regarding Vladimir Putin's dwindling strategic options as of summer 2026. The picture painted by these intelligence assessments is of a deeply cornered regime running out of time.
Ukrainian long-range, domestically produced drones are fundamentally changing the geography of the war. They aren't just fighting artillery duels in the mud of the Donbas trenches anymore. Ukrainian drones are flying hundreds of miles and creating massive systemic fuel crises deep inside Russian territory.
They are precisely hitting vital, hard-to-replace infrastructure, like the major oil export terminals in St. Petersburg and refineries across the country. You literally have fuel shortages and panic queues at civilian petrol stations inside a global petrostate.
And the human toll for the Russian military is entirely unsustainable. Western intelligence estimates that Russia is losing roughly 35,000 troops killed or severely wounded every single month.
That attrition rate vastly exceeds their logistical capacity to train and replace them without initiating a full, nationwide general mobilization. And Putin knows that drafting the sons of the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg carries massive, potentially fatal domestic political risks to his regime.
So the military analysts break down his remaining escalation options into four distinct categories. First, conventional military escalation, just throwing more men and tanks into the meat grinder.
But as we just said, he's running out of trained men, his armor is depleted, and launching more million-dollar cruise missiles at apartment buildings isn't shifting the strategic balance on the front lines.
Second, nuclear escalation.
Which is always the terrifying wild card. But Western officials reportedly view it as significantly less credible now than they did in 2022. Intelligence suggests that Chinese President Xi Jinping has explicitly privately warned Russia against using tactical nuclear weapons.
Because that would break the ultimate taboo.
The Kremlin knows that breaking the nuclear taboo wouldn't just alienate their few remaining economic lifelines like China and India. It would likely trigger overwhelming, direct conventional intervention by NATO forces, which would destroy the Russian military entirely.
The third option is direct NATO conflict. Staging a deliberate provocation, perhaps a border incursion in the Baltics, to test Article 5 and try to politically divide the alliance.
But again, Russia's army is decimated. Intentionally opening a second front against a rearming, highly alert NATO would be strategic suicide.
Which leaves only the fourth option, and this is exactly where we are seeing highly alarming coordinated activity right now, hybrid warfare.
The gray zone.
Exactly. Because Russia knows it cannot win a direct conventional war against the combined industrial might of the West, they are resorting to campaigns of covert, deniable sabotage.
They operate in the gray zone actions that are deeply damaging, but deliberately fall just below the threshold that would trigger a formal Article 5 military response from NATO.
The sources detail a terrifying string of recent plots. We're talking about intelligence operatives allegedly planting incendiary explosive devices hidden in DHL courier parcels across Europe, attempting to bring down cargo planes.
There's a highly sophisticated, disrupted assassination plot directly targeting the CEO of Rheinmetall, the massive German arms manufacturer supplying artillery to Ukraine.
And they are actively mapping, surveying, and implicitly threatening the vital undersea internet cables and energy pipelines that connect Europe to the world.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of a cornered, wounded animal lashing out in every direction. But despite the terror of these gray zone tactics, the overall assessment from Western policymakers outlined in the sources is quietly, cautiously optimistic.
They believe that if Ukraine can simply maintain this grinding pressure, and if the West can sustain its supply lines, the structural conditions required to finally force an end to the war could emerge by the end of this year.
Putin is running out of pawns, And he has already sacrificed his queens, to go back to our chess analogy. He is a 20th century autocrat, fundamentally trapped and bleeding out in a 21st century war of attrition.
Precisely. So let's zoom all the way out and look at the massive landscape we've covered today. We started by looking at the terrifying math of how a $7,000 drone dismantled a superpower's military accounting and shattered the Gulf's security architecture.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We explored the radical new blueprints for Middle East peace, from the complex economics of a 23-state solution to the deep psychological reconciliation required for a two-state confederacy. We watched Europe desperately trying to rearm itself while fracturing internally under the crushing weight of inflation, energy crises, and populist insurgencies.
We confronted the chilling reality that liberal democracy is currently surviving in just 7% of the globe.
And finally, we saw how the true engine of future dominance isn't the weapons we build, but the global human talent we attract and empower, whether on the floor of an AI tech firm or the pitch of the World Cup.
The single undeniable through line connecting every single one of these disparate sources is adaptation. The empires, alliances, and economies that violently adapt to the math of the 21st century will survive. The ones that stubbornly cling to the comforting metrics of the past will crumble.
I think that is exactly the right synthesis.
And analyzing all of this brings me to one final thought I want to leave with you, the listener, to mull over long after this finishes. We spent a lot of time today discussing the external threat of AI.
Right.
We talk about how adversarial distillation is fundamentally changing how nations fight wars abroad, rendering expensive, human-made defense systems economically obsolete. But based on our discussion about the fragility of national identity, the balkanization of our media realities, and the extreme, uncompromising polarization of our domestic politics, well, what happens when that AI capability is turned entirely inward? If algorithms designed to maximize engagement are already fracturing our sense of shared citizenship today, could artificial intelligence ultimately dismantle the very concept of the cohesive nation-state from the inside out, long before a foreign adversary ever needs to fire a single shot?
Now, that is a thought to keep you up at night. The geopolitical X-ray machine isn't just broken. We might be looking at a completely different species of global power emerging in the dark. Keep questioning the narrative, stay curious, and always look beyond the headlines. We'll see you next time.
Imagine having to write a check right now for $8 million.
Just a casual $8 million.
Right, a casual $8 million.
Right.
But not to buy a massive oil tanker, and not even to buy the oil that's inside it.
No, just to insure the vessel.
Exactly, just to insure it for a single terrifying trip down one little strip of water. That is happening right now in the real world.
It is.
And somehow, in this incredibly bizarre way, that $8 million insurance premium is directly connected to, well, the fact that Silicon Valley billionaires are suddenly terrified they might lose their grip on artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah. The AI sovereignty panic.
Yeah. And if you can believe it, it's also connected to the fact that one of the most famous pop icons in history, I mean, Madonna, is fighting this very public, very physical battle against the concept of aging.
Which is a wild connection to make, but it perfectly fits.
It totally does. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. It is mid-July 2026, and today we are looking at a really intense stack of material curated from the Weekly Geopolitical Lens.
It is quite the stack today, honestly. I mean, we are pulling from high-level diplomatic analyses, global economic reports, and, cultural commentary in places like the New York Times, the Financial Times, Dawn.
It's all over the map.
It is. But you are totally right to put those three images together at the start. The oil tanker, the AI servers, and the pop star. Because underneath the surface details, every single piece of material we are unpacking today is screaming the exact same message.
Right. And the overarching narrative here, the mission for today's deep dive, is really exploring this illusion of control.
Yes, the illusion of control.
And the frantic search for meaning when that control just completely evaporates. Because whether you are looking at the United States military trying to manage a catastrophic conflict in the Middle East, or tech giants trying to, maintain a monopoly over human knowledge.
Or an individual trying to control the biology of their own body.
Exactly. Traditional power structures, the things we used to rely on to dictate reality, are just completely losing their grip. The steering wheel is no longer connected to the tires, and the car is sliding on the ice.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks. So, as we go through this, I want you, the person listening right now, to really think about where you actually feel a sense of control in your own life.
That's the core question, right?
Yeah, because in this era of complete information overload, where are your anchors? Because globally, according to these sources, the anchors are dragging along the seabed, and nowhere is that more obvious or honestly more dangerous than the Strait of Hormuz.
The joke point of the world.
Literally. So, okay, let's unpack this just to set the scene on the ground based on the diplomatic briefings we have in the stack here.
Right, so the security situation in the Gulf has utterly collapsed. You had a series of tanker attacks in Omani waters.
Right.
Gulf nations immediately pointed the finger at Iran. Then the United States responded with direct military strikes on Iranian territory.
Which is a huge escalation.
Massive. And Tehran then retaliated by striking targets in Bahrain and Kuwait. So we are looking at a full-blown regional conflagration.
And the most frustrating part of this, for anyone watching international diplomacy, and remember, we are strictly looking at this through the lens of the source material. We aren't taking sides here. But this explosion of violence comes immediately after what was billed as this massive breakthrough.
Oh, the Memorandum of Understanding.
Yes, the MOU, negotiated between U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. It was supposed to de-escalate everything. Right?
That was the promise on paper.
But now, U.S. President Donald Trump has officially declared the MOU totally void. The whole thing fell apart over one specific paragraph.
Article 5.
Article 5. I mean, it's wild that a global crisis comes down to one paragraph.
Well, Article 5 is going to be studied in international relations classes for decades, honestly. It's a textbook case study in the dangers of strategic ambiguity.
So what did the text actually say?
It instructed Iran to make, quote, arrangements for safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz without charging fees for a period of 60 days.
Which, I mean, that sounds great.
It sounds totally reasonable until you realize nobody actually agreed on what the word arrangements meant.
Right. So the U.S. and its Gulf allies read that and said, fantastic, unfettered free passage. The strait is open. We're good to go.
Exactly. And Iran read the exact same sentence and said, perfect. The United States has officially recognized our supreme authority to manage and control all traffic through the strait.
So how does a team of professional high-level diplomats draft a treaty that allows for two completely opposite realities? I mean, didn't anyone catch that?
Oh, they caught it. They do it on purpose.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Strategic ambiguity is a very deliberate tool in diplomacy. When you have two sides that are fundamentally entrenched and neither can afford to look weak to their people at home, you write a document that's deliberately vague.
Ah, so both sides can claim they won.
Exactly. Both negotiators can fly home, stand in front of their domestic audiences, and declare total victory. It is designed to just hit pause on a conflict.
But according to the foreign policy analyst in our stack, Mark Champion, that's not a peace treaty.
No, Champion calls it a time bomb. Because a ceasefire built on a completely contradictory foundation is bound to explode. Both sides basically use that 60-day window not to build trust, but to test the boundaries of that ambiguity.
Right. The U.S. military tested it by pushing oil tankers through Omani waters, deliberately turning off their transponders to see what would happen.
And Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which we should note basically functions as a massive parallel military and corporate empire inside Iran, they tested it by targeting those specific missiles.
So the ambiguity didn't resolve anything?
Not at all. It just gave them a new rule book for how to fight.
And the economic shockwaves from this testing of boundaries are just horrifying. The sources say Iran has effectively cut traffic through the strait by 95%.
It's essentially a total blockade.
Yeah, they're using sea mines, drone swarms, and direct vessel attacks to strangle a waterway that normally handles a fifth of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas. I picture it like the Strait of Hormuz is the world's most dangerous, high-stakes toll booth on the only highway out of town.
That is a perfect analogy.
And if you shut down that toll booth, the whole city starves.
Yeah.
And the macroeconomic data in these reports is just incredibly grim.
Well, global economic growth for 2026 was originally projected at 3.4%. Because of this single blockade, it has been slashed to 2.8%.
Wow.
And that brings us right back to the insurance metric you mentioned at the very top of the show.
The $8 million.
Right. So shipping insurance for a vessel transiting the Gulf used to sit at a baseline of about 0.25% of the vessel's total value. That risk premium has now spiked to 8%.
Okay, let me stop you there to just contextualize that for a second.
Yeah.
If I have a $100 million tanker, you're saying I have to pay $8 million in non-refundable cash just to secure the policy before I even turn the engine on.
Yes, exactly. And the shipping lines, they don't just eat that cost.
Obviously not.
They pass it immediately on to the global consumer through heavy freight surcharges. The system was actually on the verge of totally seizing up, to the point where the U.S. government had to step in and provide $40 billion in federal reinsurance.
Just to keep a trickle of ships moving.
Exactly. And the strain on Asia is particularly acute here. China relies on this specific waterway for 40% of its crude imports.
That's massive.
And Japan gets 70% of its Middle Eastern crude through here. They are already draining their strategic national reserves just to keep the lights on.
See, here's the part of the economic briefing that actually scared me the most.
Yeah.
We always focus on the oil, right? That's what makes the headline.
Sure, it's the obvious commodity.
But 30% of the global seaborne fertilizer trade moves through that exact same strait. Because of this blockade, the World Bank's fertilizer price index jumped over 12% in just the first 3 months of 2026.
Which triggers a terrifying chain reaction in the global food supply.
Because modern agriculture is heavily dependent on nitrogen-based fertilizers.
Right, and those fertilizers are largely produced using natural gas extracted from the Gulf. So when that gas stops flowing, fertilizer production drops, prices spike, and farmers in Asia, Africa, and South America simply cannot afford to buy it.
They plant less, the crop yields plummet, and suddenly we were staring down the barrel of severe, widespread food insecurity for the 2026 to 2027 growing season.
It's all connected.
It's totally wild to think a localized diplomatic argument over a waterway translates directly into empty grocery store shelves and skyrocketing meat prices thousands of miles away.
Well, it perfectly illustrates how fragile the globalized system truly is. And the regional workarounds, they're trying. They're failing.
Like the pipelines.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have tried pumping oil through alternative overland pipelines, but those pipes can only handle a fraction of the 20 million barrels a day that usually transit the strait.
Plus, the IRGC has been targeting those backup routes with drone strikes anyway, right?
Exactly. Qatar's entire LNG export industry is essentially frozen. Oman is refusing to pay Iranian tolls, and Iraq is being forced to route its exports north through Turkey at an astronomical cost.
Okay, so I am looking at all this economic devastation, and I have a huge structural problem with the logic here. Our reports explicitly state that by enforcing this blockade, Iran has collapsed its own oil exports by over 90%.
That's correct.
They are sneaking out whatever crude they can on the black market at a massive 20% discount. And on top of that, the U.S. revoked a Treasury waiver that previously let them sell at market rates. So they're basically committing economic suicide.
From a certain perspective, yes.
So why would any rational state leadership willingly destroy its own primary source of revenue? I mean, 90% of their export.
Because you are defining the word rational entirely through a Western capitalist lens, you are assuming the ultimate goal of a state is always maximizing its GDP.
Well, yeah, usually that's the goal.
Right. But the geopolitical analyses here suggest a totally different calculus. For the leadership in Tehran, sovereignty, regime survival, and military deterrence are infinitely more valuable than short-term economic growth.
So money doesn't matter as much as the power.
Exactly. Control over the Strait of Hormuz is the foundational pillar of their entire deterrence strategy. They view their authority over that choke point as a non-negotiable reality of their sovereignty. Top figures have explicitly stated they prefer martyrdom over yielding that control to a foreign power.
Wow.
In their view, if they surrender the strait just for the sake of selling a few more barrels of oil, they hand over their only real leverage against a militarily superior adversary.
Okay, let's pull on that thread of martyrdom because I think it completely changes the math of how wars are fought and won.
It really does.
Up until very recently, the assumption in modern warfare was that overwhelming military superiority basically guarantees victory. But the documents covering the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei show how that assumption is just completely falling apart.
The details of that strike are stark. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was killed along with his 14-month-old granddaughter in a combined U.S. and Israeli airstrike.
And the stated objective of the broader military campaign launched on February 28th was to force the unconditional surrender of the Iranian regime.
But they didn't surrender.
No. You eliminate the supreme leader, you subject the country to months of relentless airstrikes, and the regime not only survives, but it consolidates. The briefings note that Iran retained its asymmetrical strike capabilities.
Yes.
Just for clarity, what does that practically mean on the battlefield? Like, do they have hidden fighter jets or something?
No, no. Asymmetrical warfare is exactly the opposite of traditional fighter jets. It is a weaker power using unconventional tactics to exploit a stronger power's vulnerabilities.
Okay.
It means instead of trying to match U.S. naval destroyers missile for missile, the IRGC uses swarms of highly maneuverable, explosive-laden speedboats.
Just overwhelming them with numbers.
Right. It means utilizing proxy militias across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to hit soft targets. It means deploying cheap, mass-produced suicide drones that cost maybe $10,000 to build, forcing the U.S. to shoot them down with interceptor missiles that cost $2 million each.
That math is terrible for the U.S.
It is. It is a war of economic and psychological attrition, not a war of territorial conquest.
And the psychological aspect is where the assassination of Khamenei actually backfired, according to our sources. One of the pieces we read provides this incredible contrast.
The scene at the mosque.
Right. A decade ago, if you went to the Grand Mosalla Mosque in Tehran during Friday prayers, the anti-Western chants felt totally forced. The population was exhausted. They were dealing with crushing 90% inflation. They hated the corruption of the IRGC. And the revolutionary rhetoric of 1979 meant absolutely nothing to the younger generation.
The regime was deeply, fundamentally unpopular.
But the airstrike essentially handed that unpopular regime a potent, unassailable new narrative. The author describes the atmosphere in the mosque totally shifting. The defiance went from mechanical state propaganda to genuine, furious nationalism.
This is the classic rally around the flag effect. But here, it was weaponized through deep religious symbolism. The regime orchestrated a massive 6-day rolling funeral procession across multiple cities in Iran and Iraq.
6 days.
Yeah, they didn't just mourn a political leader. They deliberately and meticulously tied Khamenei's death to the deepest historical narratives of Shia Islam, specifically the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali at the Battle of Karbala.
So they took a dictator that much of the country was actively protesting against, and through political theater, transformed him into a holy martyr defending the homeland against imperial aggressors.
Which is exactly why the analysis suggests that certain hardline figures within the state apparatus, particularly IRGC Commander Ahmad Bahidi, who really emerged from this crisis as arguably the most powerful man in the country, might actually have a vested interest in prolonging the war.
Wait, why on earth would he want to prolong it? If your country is getting bombed, why stretch it out?
Because an active external war is the ultimate shield against internal accountability.
Ah, I see.
If the country is at peace, the population demands to know why inflation is at 90%, why there are severe water shortages, and why the IRGC controls so much of the civilian economy. But if the country is under existential threat from American bombs, every domestic failure can just be blamed on the war.
So the crisis actually creates a legitimizing myth that sustains their grip on power.
Exactly. Now, the sources do note that despite state media claiming 20 million people attended these funerals, the regime remains deeply isolated on the global stage.
Right. I mean, look at the guest list for the funeral. You didn't have heads of state flying in. You had a handful of lower-ranking bureaucrats and deputies from places like Russia, China, and India. The international community kept its distance.
Which basically proves this martyrdom narrative is purely for domestic consumption. But as the author points out, it was effective enough to prevent the collapse of the state.
So what's the big takeaway there?
The critical takeaway is that external military force bombing a country into submission rarely triggers organic regime change. It usually destroys local democratic resistance movements by forcing everyone to unite against the foreign invader. The author argues that any true, lasting change in Iran will only come from the 70 million plus citizens who stayed home and refused to participate in the funeral theater.
Right. So let's zoom out for a second. If the most powerful military apparatus in human history, backed by an alliance of Western powers, cannot secure its objectives through sheer force, who's actually in charge now?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because for decades, we operated under this illusion of absolute dominance. Durdana Najam's analysis in our stack argues that post-October 7, 2023, the world basically realized that hard military power has severe defining limits.
We are witnessing the definitive end of the unipolar moment.
The era of just one superpower running the show.
Yes. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the global order relied entirely on American primacy. The U.S. was the undisputed anchor. And while the United States remains the most powerful single nation, its actual leverage is incredibly constrained now.
They're spread too thin.
Washington is completely overextended. They are trying to deter a rising China in the Pacific, manage a massive land war in Ukraine, contain absolute volatility in the Middle East, and navigate the shifting loyalties of the global South, all simultaneously.
The sources describe what comes next, not as a multipolar world, but a multiplex world.
Yeah.
When I hear multiplex, I think of a massive movie theater where 12 different movies are playing at the exact same time, and nobody in the building is having the same experience.
That is actually a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
Oh, thanks.
A multipolar world implies rigid, clearly defined blocks like the Cold War, where you were either with the US or with the Soviets.
Right, very binary.
But a multiplex world is fluid, chaotic, and decentralized. Power isn't held by 2 or 3 giants anymore. It is distributed across a massive web of regional actors, non-state groups, and middle powers who switch alliances based on the issue at hand.
And during this U.S.-Iran crisis we just talked about, the actors who actually did the heavy lifting to prevent World War III weren't the traditional superpowers. It was the middle powers.
Exactly. Look at Saudi Arabia. A decade ago, their posture was highly interventionist. Today, they are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into domestic economic transformation.
They're building cities in the desert.
Right. And they desperately need regional stability to attract foreign investment for those projects, so they have become aggressive advocates for de-escalation. Then look at Turkey, expertly playing both sides of the fence, maintaining their NATO membership while building deep independent ties across the Middle East and Russia.
And you have Oman and Qatar acting as the indispensable quiet rooms where adversaries can pass notes. I found the diplomatic maneuvering of Pakistan incredibly interesting here in the sources. Usually when geopolitical analysts talk about Pakistan, it's through the lens of their internal economic crises or border security. But in this specific conflict, Islamabad carved out a totally different role.
They really found leverage in mediation. Pakistan has complex, historic ties with both the United States and Iran. When direct communication between Washington and Tehran completely broke down, Islamabad partnered with other regional actors to serve as a bridge.
So that they offered diplomatic utility over military intervention.
Yes, the superpowers literally couldn't pick up the phone and talk to each other without these middle powers plugging in the switchboard.
But here's the terrifying part. While the middle powers are scrambling to put out these fires, the actual global institutions designed to handle this, the ones built after World War II specifically to prevent global collapse, are frozen solid.
Yeah.
Rafael Mariano Grossi wrote a devastating piece in our packet about the United Nations.
It really reads like a postmortem for international diplomacy.
It does. Grossi points out that the UN has been entirely marginalized during the most defining crises of the decade. They had no meaningful impact on the war in Ukraine, and they have been completely sidelined in the conflicts involving Israel, the US, and Iran.
And because the UN is suddenly viewed as useless, it is literally going broke.
Because countries just aren't paying.
Exactly. Member states are losing confidence and simply refusing to pay their dues, triggering a massive liquidity crisis. Grossi makes the point that we don't live in a world where you can isolate problems anymore. You can't have a localized security crisis that doesn't instantly become a global economic crisis.
Right, like we saw with the fertilizer. A drone strike in the Gulf immediately spikes the cost of bread in Nairobi and stalls a factory in Stuttgart.
Interconnectivity is total, and Grossi highlights a much darker reality. The Cold War architecture of arms control is dead. Treaties have been shredded, nuclear arsenals are being rapidly modernized with new delivery systems, and the basic red phone communication channels between nuclear powers have just eroded. He argues the risk of a global nuclear conflagration is higher today than at any point since 1945.
Which is terrifying. So how does Grossi propose fixing an institution that seems entirely obsolete? I mean, what's his solution?
He calls for a major shift toward, quote, political realism over utopianism.
Unpack that for me.
Well, for its entire existence, the UN has fundamentally marketed itself on utopian ideals, the belief that you can bring nations together through a shared desire for harmony, human rights, and global brotherhood.
Kumbaya.
Right. But Grossi is saying that in a multiplex world, that is a total fantasy. You cannot unite rival nations through harmony. The only mechanism powerful enough to force cooperation today is fear. Shared existential fear.
The fear of mutual destruction.
Exactly.
Fear of another global pandemic. Fear
Yeah.
of a total collapse of the financial system. Fear of nuclear winter.
Right.
That is the only thing everyone agrees on. We don't want to die.
Yes. Realism dictates that nations only ever act in their own brutal self-interest. Therefore, the UN has to stop functioning as a bloated bureaucracy, obsessed with issuing strongly worded declarations that nobody reads anyway.
Because they don't do anything.
Right. It needs to strip down to its core function, convening adversaries who would otherwise never sit in the same room. Grossi argues they desperately need an active, aggressive Secretary General who actually goes to the front lines.
He brings up U Thant, right, the Secretary General during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
He does, because U Thant didn't just sit in New York and issue a press release. He engaged in relentless, quiet, backdoor diplomacy, providing both Kennedy and Khrushchev with the political off-ramps they needed to back down without losing face.
So Grossi's saying we need that kind of gritty, on-the-ground mediation, not more committees.
Exactly.
So we see international institutions freezing up, but according to our sources, this same breakdown of the rules-based order is happening inside individual nations too. The operating system of the state is crashing.
It is a profound domestic paralysis.
Let's look at the situation in India. Rana Zahid Iqbal's piece explores a profound crisis of identity and secularism. And again, just reporting what the author argues here, the core tension is between the founding promise of the Constitution and the actual daily conduct of the state.
Right, so following the 1947 partition, the architects of modern India established a distinctly secular constitution.
Right.
The promise was that citizenship, legal protection, and access to state resources would be entirely blind to religious identity. It was a massive, ambitious democratic experiment, but Iqbal argues that a constitution is not a magical shield. It is just ink on paper unless the daily actions of the police, the courts, and the politicians actively uphold it.
And the author details an escalating reality of religious polarization. He points to rising mob violence, systematic disputes over his historic places of worship, and a specific tactic that has gained international attention: bulldozer demolitions.
Yes, where local governments demolish the homes and businesses of minorities accused of participating in protests, often bypassing traditional judicial due process entirely.
What Iqbal is describing is the mechanism of how a state drifts away from its foundational principles. The government in New Delhi consistently reassures the international community that India remains a vibrant democracy where the rule of law applies to everyone equally.
But Iqbal's argument is that official rhetoric is meaningless if vulnerable communities live in a perpetual state of insecurity. He explicitly ties this shift to electoral politics, arguing that nationalistic ideologies and the politicization of religious identity have proven to be incredibly potent tools for winning elections.
It is a deeply troubling analysis of how majoritarianism can slowly dismantle constitutional guarantees from the inside out. Now, keeping with this theme of the state failing its core mandate, let's look at the justice system in Pakistan.
Mansoor Hussain Laghari's piece.
Yes, and it centers on a simple but very heavy premise. You can judge the true health of a nation by watching what happens when an ordinary citizen tries to get justice against someone powerful.
Laghari uses a very specific, ongoing case to illustrate a systemic disease. He details the alleged kidnapping of a Swiss national, Sophia Maria Miller, in Lahore.
Right.
And this isn't just a local crime story, because the allegations point toward individuals with close family ties to Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Ishaq Dar.
And Laghari is demanding a transparent investigation, but he is using this case to expose a much deeper historical rot within the system. He connects it directly to one of the most infamous failures of Pakistani justice: the 2002 kidnapping and murder of American journalist Daniel Pearl.
Yes. Almost 2 decades after that horrific murder, the Supreme Court of Pakistan ordered the release of the individuals convicted of the crime. Laghari argues that single decision inflicted catastrophic long-term damage on global trust in Pakistan's institutions.
Because it sent a clear message that the system is malleable.
Exactly.
It's the definition of selective justice. If you have right connections or if you belong to the right power block, the laws simply do not apply to you in the same way.
And Laghari argues that selective justice isn't just unfair, it is a poison. Over time, it completely dissolves the social contract.
A state eventually has to make a choice, right? Do you exist to protect the powerful, or do you exist to protect justice? If you choose the former, the state ultimately hollows itself out.
And if we want to understand why the state apparatus in Pakistan, particularly in the most populous province of Punjab, functions this way, we really have to look at its historical DNA. Another fascinating source in our packet traces the modern administrative mindset directly back to British colonial rule.
Oh, this historical context blew my mind.
It's incredible context.
So what does this all mean? When the British were consolidating control over Punjab in the late 19th century, They had a very specific economic goal. They wanted to transform the western riverine areas from grazing lands for pastoral nomads into highly profitable, irrigated agricultural colonies.
But to build those farms, they had to remove the pastoral communities who already lived there, and they didn't just politely ask them to leave.
Right, they engineered a legal framework to basically criminalize their entire way of life.
Exactly. The colonial administration designated many of these groups as criminal tribes. They used the law as a weapon of social engineering, moving people off valuable land and putting them under strict, punitive, bureaucratic surveillance.
And the author's core thesis is that this philosophy of governance, where an unaccountable executive bureaucracy uses the law to control the population rather than serve it, never actually went away after independence.
It's like the operating system of these countries hasn't been updated since the colonial era, and now it's crashing when trying to run a modern democracy. We just gave it a modern interface.
You see the exact same colonial DNA in proposed modern legislation, like the Habitual Offenders Act. On paper, it's framed as a crime control measure. In practice, the author argues, it is about reestablishing centralized, top-down executive authority.
Right. For a while, the bureaucracy lost some of its absolute power. Reforms like the Police Order 2002 removed law enforcement from direct district administration control. And the concept of executive magistracy, where the government official who arrests you also acts as the judge who sentences you, was struck down because it clearly violates the basic democratic principle of an independent judiciary.
The courts told the bureaucrats they couldn't have judicial power. So what did the bureaucracy do?
They didn't fight the courts directly. They just started drafting new laws that consolidate policymaking, implementation, regulation, and punishment back into the hands of the civil administration, bypassing the courts entirely.
The author lists them out. The Punjab Defamation Act, designed to heavily regulate public speech. The Punjab High Security Zones Act, which gives sweeping powers to control public spaces and limit assembly. The Punjab Enforcement and Regulation Act, which creates a parallel, heavily armed field force answering directly to the administration.
And this isn't just the current government. This is a deeply entrenched pattern across multiple administrations. They rely on civil servants, not elected local officials, to force through major development projects, roads, mass transit, health initiatives.
Now, I can hear people listening to this arguing, well, if you want to get a bridge built in a developing country, you need that kind of centralized power. It's efficient.
Sure, people say that all the time.
And the author acknowledges that citizens often praise this bureaucratic efficiency. But the hidden cost is astronomical. When you bypass local government, you destroy democratic accountability. Unelected bureaucrats hold all the levers, meaning the public has absolutely no recourse when things go wrong.
And things are going terribly wrong. When you combine this lack of accountability with the selective justice we just discussed, you don't get a functioning state. You get a fractured society.
Which transitions perfectly into the analysis by Dr. Zafar Khan Safdar on the social reality of Pakistan today. He describes a nation split into two completely parallel, mutually exclusive realities.
He calls it the Great Secession.
The Great Secession.
The wealthy elite and the upper middle class have simply given up on the state. They have totally withdrawn from the public sphere. They live in sprawling, heavily guarded, gated communities like DHA. They send their kids to elite private schools. They go to private hospitals. They drink bottled water.
They hire private security firms because they don't trust the police.
Exactly. And they install massive solar arrays because they can't rely on the public power grid. They have essentially constructed a fully functioning private country stacked on top of a collapsing public one.
And because the elite have seceded, the state feels zero pressure to fund public institutions. The numbers Safdar provides are absolutely staggering. Pakistan spends roughly 0.8% of its GDP on education.
That isn't just low, that is an intentional starvation of the public system.
The human cost of that 0.8% is 20 million children currently out of school. And the statistic in Maliha Lodi's piece is the one I cannot stop thinking about. She cites a learning poverty rate of 80%.
Let's break down exactly what that metric means, because it is probably the most important number in this entire analysis.
Please do.
Learning poverty doesn't just mean a child isn't in a great school. It means that 8 out of 10 children in Pakistan by the age of 10 cannot read and comprehend a basic, simple sentence.
Oh, wow. Think about the mechanics of that. If a 10-year-old cannot read a sentence, they cannot learn math, they cannot learn science, they cannot read a manual, they cannot code. We are talking about the systemic permanent erasure of the cognitive potential of an entire generation.
It's a tragedy.
How on earth does a country build a modern, technology-driven economy when 80% of its workforce is fundamentally locked out of basic literacy?
It cannot. The public health metrics reflect the exact same systemic neglect. Public health spending sits at 0.9% of GDP. That translates directly into crumbling infrastructure, missing essential medicines, regional life expectancies well below the South Asian average, and horrifyingly high infant mortality rates.
And the poor are left to absorb the entire burden of a failing state.
While the elite build glass towers.
And Maliha Lodi delivers a brutal reality check to anyone hoping for an easy fix. She addresses the hyperbolic claims coming from some government officials who think Pakistan's recent diplomatic success acting as a mediator between the U.S. and Iran is going to result in a massive financial reward.
She points out that the ruling elite have a historical habit of using geopolitics to earn rent. During the Cold War, and again after 9/11, Pakistan aligned itself with the U.S. military apparatus in exchange for massive, multi-billion-dollar bailouts.
Right.
It created an economic mindset that always looks outward for a savior rather than looking inward to fix structural flaws.
But Lodi is very clear. The era of the geopolitical bailout is over. Washington is not going to write a blank check just because Islamabad helped pass a few messages to Tehran. Pakistan is currently negotiating its 24th IMF program. They are caught in a permanent loop of rolling over debt liabilities just to avoid default, while actual domestic investment is dead in the water.
Which brings us to the core sociological insight in Dr. Safdar's analysis. He uses the historical concept of asabiya. It's a term coined by the ancient scholar Ibn Khaldun, which basically translates to social solidarity or shared purpose. Safdar argues that Pakistan has completely lost its asabiya.
Because of the Great Secession we talked about. When the elite live entirely in a private bubble, the failure of the state is no longer a shared experience. If a public school in a rural village literally collapses, the elite experience that as a distant, abstract news headline. It isn't a personal emergency because their children are safely in a private school in London.
Exactly. It severs the essential feedback loop of governance. In a healthy society, when public services fail, the powerful elite feel the pain and use their influence to force reforms. When the elite insulate themselves, that pressure disappears.
The system is allowed to rot because the people with the power to fix it don't use it.
And this rot breeds what Safdar calls the age of anger. We're looking at a country of nearly 250 million people, making it the 5th most populous in the world. And critically, 64% of that population is under the age of 30.
So you have a massive youth bulge colliding with a totally broken economy.
Right. Youth unemployment is hovering near 10% officially, but millions more are trapped in informal, highly insecure, daily wage labor.
And the psychological toll is devastating. Safdar cites UNICEF data showing that 1 in 4 adolescents experience severe anxiety or depression, and a university study showing 51% of students exhibit depression symptoms.
The anger he describes isn't just about a specific policy. It isn't something a politician can fix by passing a bill. It is a generalized, pervasive, structural fury. It is the deep psychological trauma of downward mobility, the collective realization by millions of young people that despite doing everything right, they are going to live far worse lives than their parents.
And what makes this historical moment uniquely volatile is the introduction of the digital amplification loop.
The algorithm.
Let's talk about how the algorithm changed the nature of this anger. You have 64 million young people spending hours every day on social media platforms. And we know how these platforms work. The algorithm doesn't reward nuance. It doesn't reward slow, methodical policy analysis.
No, it is explicitly designed to reward and amplify highly emotional, outrage-inducing content.
So you take highly valid, rational economic grievances, like the fact that families cannot afford basic groceries because inflation peaked at 38%, and you feed it into a digital machine that accelerates and distorts it.
Safdar compares it to the Gilets jaunes or Yellow Vest protests in France or the massive student uprisings in Chile. In all those cases, the core anger was a totally rational response to a broken social contract. It wasn't just digital manipulation. The pain was real.
But in Pakistan, Safdar points out that there are no legitimate institutional outlets for this fury. The political parties operate like feudal tribes. The justice system, as we discussed, is viewed as captured by the elite. So when this digitally amplified anger spills into the streets, the state doesn't respond with governance or reform.
It responds with brute coercion. It treats its own youth population as a security threat.
It is an incredibly dangerous dynamic. You have a state failing to provide basic meaning or stability, and a population desperate for a way forward.
Which naturally makes you wonder, if the nation-state is failing so spectacularly to organize society, maybe technology is the new organizing force.
Right. If governments can't provide stability, maybe the tech giants building artificial intelligence will. But as we pivot to the AI battlefield section of our stack, our sources reveal that the exact same illusion of control is shattering in Silicon Valley.
David Wallace Wells' article explores a fascinating, massive shift in the AI business model, sparked by a recent, highly explosive interview on CNBC's Squawk Box featuring Palantir CEO Alex Karp.
Oh man, I highly recommend finding the clip of this interview. Karp is completely unfiltered. He went on national television and absolutely torched the prevailing business model of the closed-source AI leaders companies like OpenAI and Anthropic.
He argued that their token-based pricing is essentially a fraudulent wealth tax on American enterprise.
We need to explain what token-based pricing actually means because it is the core of his argument.
Yeah, let's break it down. When a company uses a frontier AI model, they don't buy the software, they rent access to it. And the AI charges them based on tokens.
Right.
Think of a token as a piece of a word or a single syllable. Every time the AI reads a prompt, and every time it generates a response, a meter is running, charging fractions of a cent per token.
Which sounds super cheap until you realize the scale of enterprise data. If a major bank wants an AI to analyze a 10,000-page regulatory document and then compare it to 10 years of customer transaction histories, the token count explodes into the billions.
The meter spins out of control.
Exactly. Companies are realizing that implementing these closed-source models for routine tasks is prohibitively expensive.
Karp went on TV and literally said the jig is up. He claimed the giant AI labs are overhyping the capabilities of their proprietary models, charging exorbitant rent and covertly swallowing up their clients' intellectual property in the process. He used the interview to pitch Palantir's new manifesto for AI sovereignty.
The pitch is simple. Governments, militaries, and major corporations should not be renting their intelligence from a handful of tech billionaires. They should build, own, and control their own models entirely in-house, utilizing open-source architecture.
Oh, I know you were going to push back on Karp's motives here.
Oh, I absolutely am, because this feels like a masterclass in talking your own book.
It definitely is.
Wait, isn't Alex Karp just talking his own book here to sell a new defense tech vision aligned with the Silicon Valley defense bloc? It's no coincidence that right before this interview, France's intelligence services dropped Palantir, citing concerns over data privacy and national sovereignty.
Right.
Karp isn't suddenly a champion of the little guy. He is on television explicitly pitching a massively lucrative new partnership with NVIDIA to deploy open models in secure, air-gapped environments for defense contractors. It's a highly calculated sales pitch.
His motives are entirely self-interested, yes. But that doesn't mean his underlying analysis of the technology landscape is wrong. Karp is pointing out a massive paradigm shift.
Which is what?
For the last few years, the staggering capital expenditure in AI, the billions of dollars spent on supercomputers and energy, was justified by the winner-take-all theory. The assumption was that one company would achieve artificial superintelligence, or ASI, first.
And they would rule the world.
Basically, they would achieve a godlike technological advantage, build an unbreakable moat, and establish a permanent unipolar monopoly on machine intelligence.
But the moat is drying up. The closed-source models haven't been able to maintain a commanding lead. Open-source models where the underlying code is freely available to anyone are catching up incredibly fast.
Yeah.
We are seeing models out of China, like DeepSeek, performing at near-frontier levels for a fraction of the cost.
This dynamic has created a total panic within the big tech labs, centered around the tension between two concepts, distillation and diffusion.
Okay, what is distillation?
Distillation is what the big labs are terrified of. It is essentially high-tech IP theft. It occurs when a smaller competitor uses the brilliant, highly expensive outputs of a premium model to rapidly and cheaply train their own knockoff model.
So they just copy the smart kids' homework.
Exactly. The big labs are currently lobbying Congress desperately to protect them from distillation.
But the real economic value of AI might not be about who builds the absolute smartest God computer in a vacuum. It might be about diffusion.
Yes. Diffusion.
Diffusion is how easily and cheaply these tools can actually be integrated into existing human workflows, how quickly a hospital can use it to schedule nurses, or a logistics company can use it to route trucks. If open-source models are 95% as smart as the premium models, but cost a tenth of the price to run locally, diffusion wins.
And this realization is fundamentally altering how the government views the tech sector. Our sources mention that internal drafts circulating within the U.S. Treasury Department are flagging the massive concentration of capital in a few giant AI labs as a potential systemic macroeconomic risk.
Because they're worried these companies are becoming too big to fail.
Right, but without actually securing the monopoly they promise their investors.
It completely flips the ideological script on technology. Just a few years ago, you had venture capitalists like Peter Thiel arguing that crypto was inherently libertarian and decentralized, while AI was inherently centralized and communist because it required massive centralized pools of data and computing power.
The new reality suggests AI isn't going to be a centralized authoritarian tech empire at all. It is fracturing. It is becoming a chaotic, highly competitive, decentralized landscape.
So instead of a single god computer ruling the world, AI might just become a low-margin, heavily commoditized utility, exactly like electricity or the internet itself.
The illusion of a tech monopoly is breaking down just like the illusion of superpower dominance.
We've talked about geopolitics, failing states, and the chaotic frontier of AI. With all these massive systemic forces failing to provide stability, where are everyday people finding meaning and connection?
It turns out they're looking in two very different places.
Yes, stadiums and pop stars.
It is a remarkable pivot, but it strikes at the absolute core of the human condition. When the structural anchors give way, we instinctively seek out emotional and communal anchors. Let's examine Shadi Hamid's essay on his unexpected transformation from a cynical sports skeptic to a fervent believer.
Hamid is a serious geopolitical analyst, and he admits he used to openly mock sports fans. He actually went viral a while back for a tweet where he criticized the intense collective rituals of sports, saying he felt deeply uncomfortable around fervent public displays of emotion. He viewed it as primitive.
But then he spent a summer sabbatical in New York City during a deeply unlikely playoff run by the New York Knicks, and he watched the World Cup.
And being physically present in those spaces, experiencing that raw, unifying energy firsthand, completely dismantled his skepticism.
He frames his new understanding using the sociologist Emil Durkheim's concept of collective effervescence.
I love this concept. Let's dig into that.
Durkheim argued that humans have a fundamental, hardwired need to experience a shared emotional resonance. Hamid compares modern sports stadiums to ancient houses of worship. He argues that Sunday football isn't just entertainment. It is a weekly devotion that satisfies a universal religious impulse.
The deep desire to connect with something transcendent, something larger than the isolated individual self. He actually coins the term sportianity.
But here is the most brilliant part of his argument, connecting it directly to the geopolitical anger we discussed earlier. Hamid points out that human beings possess an innate historical tribalism. We have a dark thirst for war and division.
But sports serve as a necessary constructive release valve for that exact impulse. It allows us to channel our most aggressive tribal instincts safely without resorting to actual violence.
It creates a we out of an I in a world that is highly atomized. Hamid describes the visceral experience of watching the U.S. men's national soccer team beat Bosnia, or sitting in a local hookah lounge surrounded by strangers cheering for Egypt.
Here's where it gets really interesting. In those highly charged moments, your personal anxieties, your economic class, your political isolation, it all instantly dissolves into a shared collective identity. Cheering for an NBA team or a World Cup team instantly dissolves political isolation.
And crucially, sports offer something that modern politics and economics rarely provide: redemptive, unfiltered joy.
Think about it. Usually, diverse groups of people only come together in the streets in the wake of a horrific tragedy, a natural disaster, or a protest against an injustice. Sports is one of the only mechanisms in modern society that brings highly divided communities together through pure joy and shared vulnerability.
And the beauty of it is that the stakes are ultimately incredibly low. Hamid makes the point that modern politics has become dangerously, violently toxic precisely because we have taken this deep religious tribal intensity and applied it to elections, where the stakes are existential.
When you apply tribalism to control of the state, people get hurt.
Exactly. Sports demand that exact same level of tribal intensity, but when your team loses a playoff game, there are no riots, no regime changes, no economic collapses. You just go to work the next day feeling disappointed. It is a necessary mercy, a much gentler, safer arena for human division.
It provides the emotional release without the systemic destruction. We can exert a tiny bit of emotional control by choosing our tribe, which brings us to our final source, and perhaps the most intimate, Devastating examination of the illusion of control in our entire stack, a cultural reflection on Madonna, and the human fear of aging.
The author of this essay reflects on a lifelong, profound admiration for Madonna. For over 4 decades, Madonna single-handedly shaped the global culture's understanding of female independence, sexuality, and self-expression.
She didn't just push boundaries, she bulldozed them. Like a virgin, entirely redefined how female sexuality was discussed in pop culture. Like a prayer, deliberately provoked the most powerful religious institutions in the world.
Vogue took underground ballroom and LGBTQ plus culture and placed it firmly in the global mainstream. Her book, Sex, celebrated human sexuality openly and unapologetically long before society deemed it acceptable.
Madonna was the ultimate defiant symbol of individual control. Control over one's own narrative, one's own body, and one's own artistic output. She rebelled successfully against every single societal expectation placed upon her.
But the author of this piece expresses a deep, lingering sense of disappointment with what Madonna's public image represents today.
Because rather than taking that same defiant energy and challenging the brutal beauty standards associated with aging, the author feels Madonna has succumbed to them. The essay focuses on her extensive cosmetic enhancements, arguing that they reflect a submission to society's relentless, punishing obsession with youth.
The author genuinely hoped that Madonna, of all people, would show the world that a woman could maintain her ferocious confidence, her power, and her sexual agency while aging naturally, that she would refuse to sacrifice her dignity to the surgeon's knife.
Instead, the author feels Madonna has yielded to the very patriarchal expectations she spent her entire life trying to dismantle. She has become an emblem of the cultural sickness that dictates a woman's value is entirely tied to a youthful appearance, and that the natural process of aging is a disease to be resisted at all costs.
But the essay takes a very profound, empathetic turn at the end. It stops criticizing Madonna as an individual failing a feminist test and shifts to questioning society as a whole. The author realizes that Madonna is not failing us. She is simply exposing incredibly uncomfortable truths about human nature.
She is acting as a mirror. The truth is, almost everyone fears aging. We fear the loss of relevance, the loss of physical vitality, the proximity to mortality.
And in our society, physical beauty is inextricably linked to social and economic power. The author concludes that very few people would willingly surrender their youth and power if they possessed the immense financial resources required to artificially preserve it.
And that, right there, is the ultimate illusion of control. We can build vast empires, we can launch airstrikes across the globe, we can write complex laws to cage populations, we can program artificial superintelligence that reads billions of tokens a second, but we absolutely cannot control time.
We cannot stop the biological clock.
The author concludes that Madonna is still the ultimate cultural mirror. But today, she isn't reflecting our sexual repression back at us. She is reflecting our deep, collective, existential anxiety about losing control over our own bodies.
The ultimate transgression in modern society isn't sexual rebellion anymore. The ultimate transgression is the refusal or the inability to visibly age.
It synthesizes the entire deep dive perfectly. From the massive geopolitical maneuvering in the Gulf to the deeply personal struggle reflected in a pop star's face, we are witnessing humanity struggling against forces it simply cannot master.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at the definitive failure of superpowers to control the Strait of Hormuz, proving that raw military might can no longer dictate terms in a fluid, multiplex world.
We examined the freezing of the United Nations and the collapse of the social contract within states like India and Pakistan, where the promise of justice is actively crashing against colonial bureaucracy and the secession of the elite.
We saw how the tech giant's desperate attempt to monopolize artificial intelligence is being fundamentally undermined by the chaotic, decentralized reality of open-source diffusion.
And finally, we explored how, amidst all this macro-level failure, everyday people are actively seeking meaning and connection through the redemptive joy of sports, while simultaneously fighting a losing, terrifying battle for control over time itself.
Every single piece of material in this stack tells the exact same story. A world desperately searching for new anchors as the old authorities, the state, the military, the tech monopoly lose their grip.
Which leaves us with a final, vital thought to consider. If the old systems of control are genuinely cracking, it means the future isn't going to be handed down from the top anymore.
It is not going to come from a superpower dictate or a tech billionaire's closed-source algorithm. The future is going to be built from the middle by the mediators, the open-source creators, and the communities we choose to engage with.
The critical question for you, listening to all this, is,
Yeah.
in a world where the macro forces are completely out of your control, what are you choosing to build, protect, and nurture in your own micro world?
That is the perfect question to leave things on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time to explore the forces shaping our world. But until then, keep your hands on the wheel, even if you are just sliding on the ice.
Right now, as we sit here, the companies that make up the S&P 500 are sitting on $2.2 trillion in cash reserves, just, sitting there.
Yeah, it's a staggering number when you actually visualize it.
Right, because to put that into perspective for you, if you took that pile of cash and just made it a country, it would be the 8th largest economy on the planet.
Oh, easily. I mean, it's bigger than Italy.
Bigger than Brazil. And what we are seeing is that these entities are starting to act, well, less like traditional businesses accountable to shareholders and much more like sovereign nations accountable to absolutely no one.
It completely breaks the traditional models of global diagnostics. I mean, for decades, if you wanted to understand how the world worked, you just looked at a map.
Right.
You looked at the borders, you mapped out the trade agreements between nation A and nation B, and you could reasonably predict what was going to happen. It was, like reading an engineering schematic.
But today, that schematic is effectively useless. The diagnostic X-ray machine is just broken.
Solely broken.
We are looking at a landscape where, say, a sudden military parade in the Middle East can instantaneously freeze a family's ability to heat their home in Europe.
Yeah.
Or where teenagers in New York are deliberately buying obsolete flip phones as this weird form of geopolitical protest.
It's just fascinating, yeah.
And where the foundational anchor of the entire global order, the United States, is undergoing a profound, almost mythic identity crisis.
It's a phenomenon that weaves through every layer of society right now, from macroeconomics to individual psychology. We can basically call it the great fragmentation.
The great fragmentation. Let's unpack that.
Well, the old rule books for politics, economics, technology, and society, they aren't just being revised. They're being actively thrown out.
And that is exactly what we are mapping out today. Welcome to the deep dive. We have a massive mission ahead of us, honestly.
We really do.
We are pulling together this towering stack of geopolitical analysis, economic reporting, and cultural observations from places like The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and Wired, all to figure out the hidden architecture driving this fragmentation.
Because the goal is for you, our listener, to walk away with a really profound understanding of the mechanics underneath all those daily headlines.
Exactly. The surface level just doesn't explain the sheer scale of the restructuring we're witnessing.
No, not at all. To understand the fragmentation, you really have to look at the underlying incentive driving these actors, whether they are nation-states, trillion-dollar corporations, or just ordinary citizens.
Before we get into those mechanics, though, I do want to set a clear baseline for you regarding how we are going to navigate this.
Good idea.
Because we are looking at a deeply fractured world, we are inevitably going to discuss highly polarizing figures, contentious global conflicts, and, deeply charged political movements spanning both the left and the right.
And our role here is absolutely not to litigate those politics. We are not taking sides, and we certainly aren't endorsing any of the ideologies or factions we are going to talk about today.
Right. Think of us strictly as impartial guides. Our only job is to distill what these global analysts and strategists are observing on the ground.
Yeah, we're just here to break down the cold mechanics of how these global shifts actually work. We are reporting on the content provided and decoding the system, nothing more.
Perfect. So if we are going to decode this fragmented system, we have to start at the traditional center of gravity, right? We have to start with the United States.
We do, because to understand global fragmentation, you have to look at the anchor. And the entire post-World War II global order has essentially used the U.S. as its foundational operating system.
But right now, as the U.S. approaches a massive historical milestone, its 250th anniversary, that operating system is undergoing a severe identity crisis.
The semi-quincentennial. Historically, you would expect an event of this magnitude to be a masterclass in unifying national myth-making.
A moment to reflect on the republic breaking away from monarchy.
Exactly. It should theoretically be this moment of shared, cohesive celebration.
But the reality on the ground is the exact opposite. The 250th anniversary has morphed into this hyper-partisan spectacle.
It really has.
We're looking at initiatives like the Freedom 250 events, which aren't your standard historical reenactments with fireworks. These are highly politicized, often militaristic displays.
Right, like seeing UFC mixed martial arts events being woven into the fabric of official celebrations. It's aggressive, it's performative, and it's deeply divided.
And that performative aspect is crucial for understanding the current era of American leadership, particularly the political style of Donald Trump.
Yeah, because for a long time, traditional political science tried to categorize his style using old labels, words like autocrat or ideologue.
But the global analysts are increasingly abandoning those terms.
They are. Because an autocrat wants to build a rigid, lasting, highly structured empire. They want to create new rules and force everyone to follow them.
But what we are observing is fundamentally different, isn't it?
It is. Analysts are framing this current political style as a return to an ancient mythic archetype, the trickster.
The trickster, like a court jester who has suddenly seized the throne? Or maybe like Heath Ledger's Joker.
That's a great analogy, actually. An agent of chaos performing this sort of carnivalesque charade.
Right, because their power doesn't come from building a new, cohesive ideological framework. Their power comes from disruption.
Exactly. It comes from exposing the absurdities, the hypocrisies, and the hidden rules of the existing order,
Yeah.
and then just dismantling that order.
So the goal isn't necessarily to replace neoliberal globalization with a carefully constructed alternative. The goal is the dismantling itself.
Right. It's performative disruption designed to prove that the old rules of the international order were a joke to begin with.
And when the country that historically served as the rule-governed guarantor of the global system adopts this trickster persona, the ripple effects are huge.
Immediate and severe. The U.S. shifts from being viewed as a reliable anchor to being seen as entirely unpredictable, self-interested, and very transactional.
Let's get into the mechanics of that global perception, because it is wild to see how different regions are reacting to this unpredictability.
Let's start with the most immediate layer, the physical borders. Mexico and Canada.
Historically, North America has been one of the most deeply integrated economic blocs on the planet, through agreements like NAFTA and now the USMCA.
But that integration requires trust. And right now, both Mexico and Canada are operating from a position of feeling heavily coerced, like they're being bullied.
For Mexico, it's pretty easy to see the flashpoints. You have the aggressive rhetoric on immigration, threats of deploying military force against cartels on Mexican soil, and massive economic pressure.
Which naturally reignites historical resentments that date back centuries.
Right, but Canada, you don't usually associate U.S.-Canadian relations with coercion.
No, and that's what makes this shift so profound. We are seeing discussions of severe economic pressure and tariff threats leaking into mainstream discourse.
And even fringe political rhetoric about annexation.
Yeah, exactly. And the Canadian response is a massive surge in defensive nationalism. We are seeing boycotts of American goods, but more importantly, a structural effort to diversify.
They realize that having their entire economy tethered to an unpredictable neighbor is a critical national security risk.
Diversification is the engine of the great fragmentation. They are actively seeking new trade partners.
Okay, so what about the security partners? The countries that rely on the U.S. military umbrella. Look at Ukraine and Australia.
Here, the core commodity that has been lost is reliability. For Ukraine, the U.S. was the principal lifeline following the Russian invasion.
But the domestic political gridlock in Washington proved that American support is subject to the whims of partisan warfare.
Exactly. Confidence has structurally collapsed. Ukraine is now forced to view Europe as its only dependable long-term security partner, despite Europe's own internal fractures.
And Australia, I mean, they are physically isolated and deeply embedded in U.S. intelligence in the Indo-Pacific.
And yet we see the same theme emerge. Australian policymakers and the public are openly questioning whether America is a reliable long-term bet.
They're doubting if it's a partnership based on shared democratic values or just a transactional deal.
Right, a deal where they might be abandoned if the domestic political winds in the U.S. shift.
Now, let's look at the countries that have historically been adversarial, like Iran and Cuba. There is a really nuanced dichotomy here between hard power and soft power.
It's a fascinating split. In both Iran and Cuba, the public makes a very sharp distinction between the American state and the American ideal.
Meaning they still deeply admire American culture.
Oh, absolutely. They consume the media, they admire the innovation, and they view the intrinsic promise of American prosperity with deep respect.
So they love the idea of the American dream, but they deeply distrust the American government's foreign policy.
Exactly. In Iran, That distrust is fueled by the withdrawal from nuclear agreements and devastating economic sanctions. In Cuba, it's a legacy of Cold War interventions.
It creates this complex dynamic where they are hungry for the culture but entirely hostile to the foreign policy.
Which brings us to the traditional democratic allies like France, Japan, and India.
Let's start with France. They seem highly representative of the broader European anxiety.
They do. They look at American tech and entrepreneurship with admiration, but they view this chaotic, transactional, political style, this Trumpism, as a permanent fixture.
They don't see it as a temporary blip anymore.
Exactly. They fear it is a structural change in the American societal landscape.
And Japan.
Japan presents a really fascinating generational divide. The older generation, the policymakers who built the post-war miracle, feel a profound sense of disappointment as America steps back.
But the younger generation in Japan.
They don't view current U.S. leadership through a traditional geopolitical lens at all. They view it largely as a social media phenomena.
Wait, really? Just as content?
Yeah, just as viral content on their feeds.
That is wild. The most powerful office in the world reduced to a TikTok feed. And in India, we see the strategic partnership buckling under tariffs and immigration restrictions.
To the point where the aspiration for Indian students to study in the U.S. is measurably declining.
So when you aggregate all of this, all these different regional reactions, what is the macro takeaway?
The macro takeaway is deglobalization. For 70 years, the fundamental strategy for national prosperity was integration with the U.S.-led system.
And today?
Today, the fundamental strategy is active diversification. Allies and adversaries alike look at the operating system, see that it's unpredictable, and consciously decide to reduce their reliance on it.
They are hedging their bets, building alternative supply chains, seeking new security packs.
Exactly.
But, there is a massive paradox buried in this shift that we need to explore, especially regarding the domestic political debate inside the U.S.
You're talking about the progressive critique?
Yes. We've seen this powerful progressive movement aimed at honestly reckoning with America's foundational flaws, focusing on the legacy of slavery, indigenous displacement, and systemic injustice.
Right, which is a necessary historical reckoning.
Yeah.
It seeks to reframe the national narrative around actual realities rather than just mythic, heroic triumphs.
But the geopolitical analysts point out a completely unintended consequence of this critique. How does relentlessly pointing out the flaws in the system inadvertently empower the trickster archetype we were just talking about?
Its mechanism of moral legitimacy. The paradox works like this. If a progressive critique relentlessly emphasizes that the American system was always fundamentally flawed.
That its institutions were always oppressive.
Right, and that the moral high ground of the rule-based international order was always a hypocritical illusion. Well, it inadvertently provides a philosophical permission slip for pure cynicism.
Because if the rules were always rigged, why should anyone bother defending them?
Exactly. It legitimizes amoral realism. If you convince the public that the system was always corrupt, then the trickster who comes along and says, yes, it's corrupt, so let's smash it, sounds completely rational.
Wow. There is no moral incentive left to play by the old rules of diplomacy. It creates a complete vacuum of idealism.
It really does.
So, returning to our operating system analogy, the foundational code of the global network is scrambling itself, releasing unpredictable updates, and telling the other apps on the network that the code was always garbage anyway.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So how do those other apps, the regional powers, react when that central authority weakens?
Well, geopolitics abhors a vacuum. When the primary global superpower becomes unpredictable, regional powers instantly begin to militarize to secure their own spheres of influence.
And because the global economy is still physically tethered to geography, that regional militarization immediately cascades into global economic crises.
Instantly. And the most glaring example of this right now is Iran.
Yes, Iran. To understand the shift there, we have to look at a highly symbolic event, the 6-day state funeral for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Right. Now, typically when a supreme leader in a theocracy dies, the state funeral is intensely religious.
It's a moment of theological mourning focused on clerical succession.
But that is not what happened. The funeral proceedings fundamentally morphed into a massive anti-American victory parade and an unprecedented projection of military strength.
Analysts are pointing to this event as the definitive dawn of what they are calling Iran's Second Republic. Break down this concept for us. What fundamentally changed?
Well, since the 1979 revolution, Iran has been a clerically run theocracy. The ultimate authority rested with religious scholars.
Right, the clerics.
But this funeral showcased a definitive transfer of power away from the clerics and toward the military, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
So we are witnessing the transition from a theocratic state to a military-run, ultranationalist dictatorship.
Exactly. And the optics of the funeral made this shift undeniable. The IRGC orchestrated the proceedings. They explicitly prioritized Iranian national flags and nationalist iconography over traditional Islamic religious symbols.
And they sidelined prominent moderate clerical figures, right?
Completely sidelined them. It was a show of force designed to tell the Iranian public and the world exactly who is in charge now.
What about the succession itself? I mean, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son.
This is the critical piece of the puzzle.
Hmm.
Mojtaba Khamenei has remained virtually entirely out of the public eye. He hasn't been delivering theological sermons.
So when written statements are released in his name?
They don't read like religious edicts. They read exactly like military communiques. The consensus is that he has been installed essentially as a figurehead.
Providing a veneer of continuity, but really just rubber stamping the IRGC generals.
Precisely.
Okay, so we have a major regional power transitioning into an ultranationalist military state with something to prove. How does that internal shift spill over and hit the global economy?
It spills over immediately into one of the most sensitive economic choke points on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Persian Gulf.
Right, because the IRGC started aggressively escalating clashes. We saw attacks on commercial tankers, retaliatory strikes from the U.S. on southern Iran.
And we saw Iran projecting power outward by launching attacks on neighboring states like Bahrain and Kuwait. They even routed parts of the funeral procession through neighboring Iraq, accompanied by heavily armed proxy militias.
Just to demonstrate their absolute control over the regional ground game, it is a massive flex. But I want to pause here and connect this directly back to you, our listener.
Because it's easy to hear about tanker skirmishes in the Gulf and think of it as distant geopolitical noise.
Exactly. But this has an immediate, quantifiable, and terrifying impact on global survival. We need to talk about the mechanics of the LNG crunch, liquefied natural gas.
This is where the fragmentation becomes a kitchen table issue. The Persian Gulf is the central artery for global energy flows. Because of the IRGC's escalation, global LNG flows have been slashed by 20%.
Let that sink in. 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas supply has effectively vanished from the market.
And furthermore, 17% of Qatar's vital export capacity was physically damaged in the crossfire.
A 20% supply shock is catastrophic. But how does this actually play out in the market? Walk us through the mechanics of how a supply shock in the Middle East pits a family in Europe against a family in Asia.
It comes down to how energy is bought and sold globally, specifically on the spot market.
Okay, the spot market.
Right. LNG isn't just sold on long-term 10-year contracts. A massive portion of it is sold on the spot market, which means a buyer is purchasing a cargo of gas at whatever the current market price is right now for immediate delivery.
So it's basically an ongoing global auction.
Exactly. Now introduce the perfect storm. You have this massive 20% supply deficit. At the exact same time, Asia is getting hammered by scorching summer heat waves.
Driven by extreme weather patterns like El Nino.
Yeah. And when it gets that hot, a country's electrical grid is pushed to the absolute brink because everyone turns on their air conditioning.
So to keep the grid from collapsing, they desperately need immediate energy.
So they go to the spot market, they flood the market, they are desperate, so they are willing to pay astronomical prices.
Okay, so picture a massive LNG tanker ship that just left a port in the United States. It was originally scheduled to sail across the Atlantic to Europe.
Right, to help European countries slowly fill up their gas storage tanks for the upcoming winter.
Mid-ocean.
Mid-ocean, an energy trader looks at the spot market and realizes that buyers in Asia are willing to pay triple what the Europeans are paying.
Oh, wow.
So the trader reroutes the ship. The American gas that was supposed to go to Europe is diverted to Asia.
And as a result, Europe is left completely empty-handed.
The downstream effect is severe. European gas storage levels are currently sitting at a 15-year low, barely at 47% capacity heading into the autumn.
They just do not have the buffer they need to survive a cold winter.
And analysts are outlining 3 specific compounding risks that could turn this vulnerability into a massive humanitarian crisis.
Let's walk through the mechanics of each one. What's the first risk?
The first risk is a delayed Gulf recovery. If the IRGC maintains its aggressive posture, and if Qatar's infrastructure takes longer to repair, that 20% supply deficit becomes structural.
It doesn't bounce back. It becomes a permanent feature of the winter season. And the second risk involves China, right?
Yeah, China is the world's largest importer of LNG. If China gets hit with sudden, extreme weather anomalies, like a late summer heat wave or an early freeze, their grid will panic.
And if they enter the spot market with their massive financial weight,
They will act like a vacuum, sucking up absolutely whatever gas is left on the global market.
leaving everyone else in the dark. Okay, what's the third risk?
The third risk is the terrifying interconnectivity of our failing infrastructure. Think about how power grids work. They rely on a mix of sources. What happens if prolonged climate-driven dry spells cause major hydropower reservoirs to dry up?
The hydro dams just stop generating electricity.
Right. And when hydro fails, grid operators have to instantaneously replace that lost power to prevent blackouts. Their only reliable backup is usually to fire up gas plants.
So, right at the exact moment when global natural gas is the most scarce and expensive, demand structurally spikes because green energy is failing.
It is a chilling chain of causality.
It really is. A funeral in Tehran turns into a military parade. The IRGC flexes its muscle. Tankers get spooked. A heat wave in Asia causes traders to reroute ships.
And as a direct result, a family in Europe might literally not be able to afford to heat their home this winter.
They might be forced to choose between heating and eating. In a fragmented world, local political instability translates into global survival issues almost at the speed of light.
It's terrifyingly fast.
That is just staggering. But Iran is just one regional node in this fragmenting system. We have to look at another massive nuclear power dealing with severe internal strain.
Russia.
Yes, Russia. The prolonged warfare in Ukraine has placed the Russian state under immense, sustained pressure.
And what's fascinating is that we are starting to see the cracks in the facade publicly, coming from the very top of the Russian elite.
We are talking about Andrei Melnichenko. He is known as the billionaire fertilizer king, and he is doing something fundamentally dangerous in modern Russia.
He is breaking the unwritten rule of the oligarch class and speaking out publicly against the Kremlin's trajectory.
Now, to understand why Melnichenko matters, you have to understand his industry. He isn't just a random billionaire. Fertilizer is the bedrock of global food security.
Exactly. He sits at the nexus of massive global supply chains. But it's vital to note that he is not speaking out as an idealistic human rights champion.
Right. He's a pure pragmatist.
He is a ruthless industrialist. He is looking at the macro data. He sees the crippling fuel shortages, the drone strikes isolating the Crimean Peninsula, the societal impact of forced mobilization.
And he's doing the math. He realizes the current trajectory is structurally unsustainable for the Russian state and, by extension, his business empire.
So he lays out 4 potential distinct scenarios for Russia's future if this path isn't altered.
And frankly, they sound like the world building for 4 different dystopian sci-fi novels. Let's walk through these. What is the first scenario?
The first scenario is anarchy. Total institutional collapse.
Like warlords battling in the streets.
Yeah, a chaotic descent where rival warlords, regional governors, and private military factions battle for control over Russia's vast natural resources.
And the terrifying aspect of that is the fate of Russia's massive nuclear arsenal in a country with no central command structure.
Okay, what if they manage to avoid total collapse? What is the second scenario?
The second scenario is vassalage, specifically Chinese dependency.
So the Russian state survives, but it entirely loses its geopolitical sovereignty.
Exactly. It becomes a subservient, resource-rich buffer state against the West, functioning essentially as a massive, discounted raw material supplier designed solely to feed the Chinese industrial machine.
Basically, they trade sovereignty for survival. What's the third path? The European periphery scenario. This envisions Russia remaining somewhat intact and independent, but existing as a deeply impoverished, isolated nation on the edge of Europe.
An economy defined by stagnation and violent nationalism, blaming the outside world for its poverty.
Right. And if the Kremlin decides to double down on total control, we get the fourth scenario.
The North Korea model.
Yes, the fortress state. Russia cuts itself off entirely from the global economy. It exists in a permanent state of ideological and physical mobilization against the West.
Requiring absolute totalitarian domestic repression just to maintain order. An autarkic state where the borders are sealed.
If you are an industrialist trying to run a global fertilizer empire, every single one of those 4 options is a death sentence for your business.
Which is why the technocrats are panicking. And the analysis points to a deeply ingrained historical precedent that is undoubtedly on their minds. The year 1905.
Yes, 1905, the culmination of the Russo-Japanese War.
Right. The Russian Empire, an absolute autocracy under Tsar Nicholas II, suffered a humiliating military defeat by Japan.
And that failure shattered the myth of the Tsar's invincibility. It triggered massive domestic unrest. And critically, it forced the Tsar to make immense concessions to the industrialist and technocratic classes.
It led directly to constitutional reforms and the creation of the State Duma. So the historical lesson is that in Russia, a catastrophic military stalemate creates the exact pressure required to force structural political change.
Exactly. But the Kremlin is acutely aware of that history. And this creates the ultimate geopolitical dilemma. They know they are trapped.
So to prevent a 1905 scenario, they basically have two levers: dramatically increase domestic repression to a Stalinist level, or aggressively escalate the conflict to break the stalemate.
And that escalation lever is where the ultimate global nightmare lies. The analysts note that Melnichenko and others are terrified the Kremlin might resort to deploying a tactical nuclear weapon out of sheer desperation.
Now, we should state that Western intelligence remains highly skeptical that this will actually happen. The military utility is low, and the blowback would be absolute.
But the terrifying takeaway is that leading Russian industrialists are explicitly factoring nuclear escalation into their corporate risk models.
Let me push back on Melnichenko's proposed solution here, though. He isn't calling for a revolution. He is proposing an appeal to the West for a new framework of peaceful coexistence.
Right, asking for a form of non-interference sovereignty.
But let's be real. After the invasion, the mass casualties, the sanctions, can the West just say, okay, let's reset the board and go back to business as usual? Is that even realistic?
It highlights a massive blind spot in the technocratic worldview. He assumes geopolitics operates like a corporate negotiation where everything has a price.
But it perfectly illustrates the desperation of the Russian elite. They are frantically searching for an off-ramp
Before the machinery of the state grinds them into dust.
So we've spent the first half of this deep dive looking at the fragmentation of traditional nation-states. But here is where the diagnostic map truly breaks.
While national governments are bogged down, an entirely different class of entity has quietly amassed unprecedented sovereign power: the massive multinational tech corporations.
The numbers detailing this shift are almost too large to comprehend. We are witnessing the rise of entities that are richer, more unified, and arguably more powerful than many of the nations attempting to regulate them.
The structural flow of capital is staggering. Let's look at the mergers and acquisitions market. A mega merger is defined as a corporate deal exceeding $10 billion.
$10 billion in a single transaction.
And those mega mergers now account for a record-breaking 48% of all deal value this year. Almost half of the money moving in the corporate buyout space is moving in chunks of $10 billion or more.
And they have the capital to fund it. The companies comprising the S&P 500 are currently hoarding $2.2 trillion in cash reserves,
driven by near-record profit margins. But the real story is the concentration of that wealth. The top 10% of listed firms now control over 75% of the total U.S. stock market value.
10% of the companies own 75% of the wealth. That level of concentration is the highest we have seen in over a century.
And when a company gets that massive, when it holds a trillion-dollar valuation, the fundamental mechanics of capitalism begin to warp. It triggers a breakdown in traditional corporate governance.
Because for decades, the theory was that corporate governance would naturally converge on traditional shareholder capitalism, the idea that a company exists solely to maximize financial returns for its shareholders.
Right. You operate with absolute discipline, you hit quarterly earnings targets, and if the CEO fails, shareholders vote them out.
But these trillion-dollar titans have broken that model. The analysts use a brilliant phrase. They say these companies have achieved escape velocity.
They are so massive and structurally vital that the traditional disciplinary mechanisms of Wall Street simply fail to exert gravity on them. And as a result, corporate governance has fractured into four distinct, highly ideological tribes.
Let's break down the mechanics of these four tribes. The first tribe is the last remnant of the old guard, the shareholder fundamentalists.
These are companies like Apple, Amazon, and Broadcom. They are purely ruthlessly profit-driven. They are hyper-efficient machines optimized to maximize wealth within the traditional capitalist framework.
Okay, that makes sense. They play by the old rules just at a massive scale. But the second tribe is where things shift, the corporate paternalists.
This tribe is defined by founders or patriarchal figures who fundamentally reject the premise that diverse shareholders know what is best for the company's future.
The prime example being Mark Zuckerberg at Meta or Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway.
Exactly. Look at Meta. Wall Street consensus was screaming at Zuckerberg to stop burning tens of billions of dollars on the metaverse. Traditional capitalism dictates the CEO must pivot.
But Zuckerberg has structured the voting shares so that he holds absolute control. He basically acts as a paternalistic sovereign, saying, I control the votes and I know the future of tech better than you.
He overrides the consensus. Track number 3 brings us directly back to geopolitics, the national champions.
These are corporations that operate for profit, but their ultimate strategic direction is inextricably tethered to the geopolitical goals of their home nations.
Companies like TSMC in Taiwan, manufacturing advanced semiconductors, or Saudi Aramco. They are state-backed capitalism realized at a massive scale, economic weapons wielded by the state.
And finally, the fourth tribe, which I think is the most radical departure, the Hobbesian enterprises.
Named after Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher who argued that to avoid chaos, individuals must willingly surrender their rights to an absolute, unquestioned sovereign authority.
And how does that apply to a tech company?
We see it in companies ruled unconditionally by a singular visionary leader. The prime example is Elon Musk with SpaceX and Tesla. In a Hobbesian enterprise, generating a quarterly profit is viewed merely as a secondary tool required to fund a much grander mission.
Like colonizing Mars.
Exactly. The investors in these companies aren't just buying a stock, they are willingly surrendering their traditional shareholder rights to the sovereign visionary. They are funding a crusade.
It fundamentally breaks the math of Wall Street. If you try to value a Hobbesian company aiming for interplanetary colonization using a standard price-to-earnings ratio, it's absurd.
It's like trying to measure the distance to the moon with a wooden ruler.
But the analysts issue a severe warning about this concentration of corporate power. Because these entities are not invincible, and their financial structures are becoming dangerously fragile.
We discussed the surge in $10 billion mega mergers. The historical data is brutal. Huge mergers have a failure rate of roughly 50%.
It is literally a coin toss whether a merger destroys value or creates it.
And historically, if a $500 million merger failed, it was just a bad quarter. But when a $50 billion merger fails, the collateral damage is catastrophic.
Plus, to fund this expansion, these giants are quietly taking on massive amounts of debt. Break down the debt mechanics here. What metric are analysts watching?
They're looking closely at the debt-to-free cash flow ratio. This metric basically measures how many years it would take a company to pay off all its debt, using only the cash it generates from normal operations.
And the analysis points out that Amazon's debt-to-free cash flow ratio has surged dramatically. So these companies are acting like untouchable empires, but they are increasingly leveraged.
And this creates a profound systemic vulnerability. If just one of these massive, debt-laden, Hobbesian or paternalist giants makes a fatal strategic error, the shockwave wouldn't just wipe out shareholders, it could structurally destabilize the global banking system.
So what is forcing these corporate tribes to abandon their cash reserves, take on massive debt, and bet the entire farm? What is the prize?
They are locked in an existential global tech arms race. Specifically, the race to dominate artificial intelligence. And this is not just a battle between Silicon Valley tribes. Nation-states are engineering their entire economies to ensure they aren't left behind.
Let's look at the mechanics of China's pivot into this space, because the sheer scale of the capital they are deploying is mind-bending.
The Chinese state recognizes that achieving self-reliance in frontier technologies like AI, advanced robotics, quantum computing is a matter of national survival.
And the infrastructure required for AI is unfathomably expensive. The analysts cite a projection that building out AI data centers alone will require an investment of 2 trillion yuan over the next 5 years.
2 trillion yuan, that's roughly $275 billion, just for the physical servers and cooling systems.
How does a state mobilize that kind of capital?
It requires state-directed financial engineering. The Chinese government is actively easing regulatory crackdowns on tech investing, launching thousands of new equity funds. But this isn't a free market.
Right, the capital is strictly steered.
Exactly. A massive portion is orchestrated through state-directed funds, funneling money exclusively toward the Communist Party's strategic policy goals.
And they heavily favor established hardware manufacturing firms over riskier software startups. But let me push back on this strategy. If you build an ecosystem where political goals override actual market returns, doesn't that just guarantee a massive bubble?
That is the exact systemic risk professional analysts are warning about. It is the classic danger of inefficient capital allocation.
Are they actually fostering innovation, or are they just mass-producing zombie tech companies that look highly capitalized but are completely incapable of competing globally?
If the state banking system becomes overloaded with non-performing loans to politically motivated tech investments that ultimately fail, it could trigger a systemic banking crisis that cripples their broader economy.
Let's pivot from the macroeconomics of data centers down to the human level. Because while governments and CEOs are throwing hundreds of billions at AI, the average person is feeling a profound dread about their livelihood.
The anxiety is intensely palpable, and the predictions are sobering. Prominent technology CEOs openly predict that AI could eliminate anywhere from 10 to 50% of entry-level white-collar jobs within a few years.
50% of white-collar jobs, and the IMF estimates that roughly 40% of all global jobs will be affected by AI. That sounds like an unavoidable economic apocalypse.
It certainly sounds like one. But economists argue this panic is largely driven by a fundamental misunderstanding of how labor markets actually work, specifically pointing to the lump of labor fallacy.
Explain the mechanics of the lump of labor fallacy.
It is the false, intuitive assumption that there is a fixed, finite amount of work to be done in an economy.
Like, there is only one pie, and if a robot eats half the pie, there is permanently less pie for humans to eat.
Precisely. But economies are highly dynamic ecosystems. When a new technology drastically lowers the cost of producing a good or service, it creates massive savings. Consumers and businesses take those savings and spend them elsewhere.
Creating entirely new demands and new categories of human labor. And the analysis introduces a second economic concept to combat the panic, the Jevons paradox.
The Jevons paradox states that when a technology greatly increases the efficiency of using a resource, it often leads to an increase in the overall consumption of that resource, not a decrease.
Give me a historical example of how that works in the workplace.
The transition from physical ledgers to electronic spreadsheets is the perfect historical parallel. When Microsoft Excel was introduced, there was absolute panic in the accounting industry.
People assumed that because a computer could calculate a massive ledger in 1 second, the demand for accountants would drop to zero.
But the exact opposite happened. Because financial modeling became so fast and cheap, businesses didn't say, great, we only need one model a year now. They said, I want a complex financial model run for every single minor decision we make.
The demand for financial analysis skyrocketed. The spreadsheet didn't eliminate the accountant, it transformed them from a human calculator into a strategic analyst.
Yes. The analysts argue that current AI fundamentally lacks common sense and human judgment. It is a powerful complement to human labor, automating repetitive tasks and forcing humans to move up the value chain.
So if the economic models suggest we aren't going to be permanently unemployed, why does the fear feel so intense?
Because the most immediate economic danger right now isn't the AI technology itself, it is the psychological fear of the technology.
Meaning that if the public becomes convinced that mass unemployment is imminent, they stop spending money.
Exactly. They hoard cash. Businesses look at the fearful consumer base, get scared, and freeze hiring and capital investment. The alarmist predictions themselves can actually trigger the very economic recession everyone is terrified of.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that psychological weight brings us to the most human aspect of our deep dive. Between geopolitical chaos, corporate leviathans, and AI, how is society actually reacting to this pressure?
Society is fracturing into two distinct paths. The first is an inward retreat, a conscious choice to unplug. The second is an outward explosion, a violent lashing out when structural systems fail.
Let's start with the retreat. I was fascinated by the analysis of the Gen Z Luddites.
The movement highlighted by the Summer of Lud Festival in New York.
Picture a festival in Brooklyn organized by people in their early 20s, true digital natives. But smartphones were strictly banned. They relied entirely on physical paper posters stapled to telephone poles.
We are talking about hundreds of young people actively chanting against generative AI and holding mock executions of their digital devices. It is a profound, visceral rejection of the modern digital architecture.
Young people are actively downgrading their hardware, hunting down old flip phones on eBay, buying cassette tapes just to force a reduction in their screen time. But the irony is just delicious.
The paradox of the modern age.
The Luddite movement is largely being popularized and spread using TikTok and Pinterest. Influencers are utilizing highly advanced algorithms to reframe a screen-free lifestyle as the ultimate aspirational aesthetic.
It really feels like the act of disconnecting has been commodified. It has become a luxury good for those who have the social and economic capital to step away from the digital grind.
But it is yielding tangible results, right? Participants report significant improvements in baseline mental health and a restored ability to maintain deep focus.
Which perfectly transitions to the second example of societal pushback and the search for identity: India. The analysts detail a massive boom in the Indian reading market, specifically the English language book market.
Which is sociologically fascinating because native English speakers represent a tiny fraction of the Indian population, yet English books dominate commercial publishing. Why?
The analysts interpret this through the lens of class and aspiration. English has been universally adopted as the language of the modern, upwardly mobile middle class. Reading in English is a unifying medium.
And the market is entirely dominated by nonfiction, a very specific, localized brand of self-improvement. But what really caught my attention is how they uniquely blend deep ancient culture with hyper-modern capitalism.
It is a highly specific cultural synthesis. We are seeing books that blend religious mythology and ruthless corporate strategy. Authors extracting modern leadership lessons directly from the ancient epic, the Mahabharata.
Or geopolitical analysis framed around the Ramayana. It's a desperate search for grounding.
The analysts argue that in India's highly collectivist society, engaging with this specific type of self-help literature provides a socially acceptable mechanism for young Indians to foster individuality. It is a tool for carving out a unique identity amidst the pressure of globalization.
That represents the peaceful internal pushback, but the analysis also documents the much darker, explosive reactions that occur when the structural systems of a society completely fail. We have to look at South Africa.
The analysis details severe, highly organized waves of anti-immigrant violence. It is a tragic manifestation of a failing state.
We are seeing the rise of xenophobic rabble-rousers like Jacinta and Mugabe Zuma who are leveraging public desperation. They're setting arbitrary deadlines, demanding undocumented immigrants leave by June 30 and using that to trigger mob violence.
But the critical piece of the analysis is that this rage is entirely misdirected. It is manufactured scapegoat. The root cause of the suffering in South Africa has absolutely nothing to do with migrant labor.
The crisis is driven by profound structural state failure. Crumbling power grids, rampant corruption, and a staggering official unemployment rate hovering above 30%, peaking near 60% among the youth.
And the economic data completely destroys the xenophobic narrative. Migrants make up roughly 4% of the population, but they actually contribute approximately 9% to the national GDP.
They are massive net economic contributors. But the mechanics of populism don't rely on economic data. When a government utterly fails to provide basic security, opportunistic agitators channel the public's valid desperation toward the most vulnerable targets.
The xenophobia is a violent outward symptom of a fractured, failing state.
And we see a different, more institutionalized kind of state fracture back in India involving the suppression of domestic dissent, the ongoing case of Umar Khalid.
Umar Khalid is a prominent left-wing human rights activist. He became one of the primary faces of the protests against a controversial citizenship law in 2019.
And following deadly riots in Delhi in 2020, Khalid was arrested under the UAPA, India's incredibly stringent anti-terror legislation, accused of masterminding the violence.
Despite the fact that he was physically located 1,600 kilometers away when the riots actually occurred.
The critical takeaway for our theme of fragmentation is the mechanics of how the judicial system itself is being weaponized. Under the UAPA laws, obtaining bail is nearly impossible.
As a result, Khalid has been imprisoned for roughly 6 years without ever facing a trial. His bail applications are systematically denied or caught in endless procedural loops.
He has been transformed into a polarizing symbol. It illustrates how broad anti-terror laws can be mechanically repurposed by a state to permanently crush political opposition without ever having to prove guilt in open court.
It provides such a stark contrast to how the great fragmentation is experienced globally. For the Gen Z Luddites, pushing back against the system is a lifestyle choice. But for activists like Khalid, survival is the primary concern.
The fragmentation hits with radically different force, depending entirely on where you are standing. Which brings us to the final, critical layer of our analysis. How are the world's major traditional institutions responding to this chaotic reality?
The short answer is, they are buckling under the pressure, they are retreating and desperately trying to restructure just to survive. Let's look at the World Bank.
The World Bank recently established an ambitious mandate to direct 45% of its global lending portfolio toward climate-related projects, funding green energy grids and coastal restoration.
But the analysis reveals they have quietly abandoned that target.
Why would the premier global development institution drop its core climate pledge?
Pure, unadulterated geopolitical pressure. The reporting attributes this reversal directly to pressure from the United States, specifically the prospect of a new Trump administration and figures like Scott Bessent, who argue climate goals hinder economic growth.
The U.S. is the World Bank's largest shareholder. The implicit threat was that if the bank prioritized climate, the U.S. might withhold funding. So the World Bank just folded.
Furthermore, there is an intense internal debate within the development community itself. The tension between funding long-term climate resilience versus funding immediate poverty relief.
Right, if you only have $10 million, do you build a wind turbine for the future or a rural health clinic today? It's an agonizing choice. But the overarching point is institutional fragility.
If a global institution can discard its primary mission statement overnight simply because one shareholder threatened to walk away, how much genuine authority do these institutions actually have left?
They are highly vulnerable to the whims of individual states. And it is not just international bodies. Look at the Bank of Japan and the historic collapse of the yen.
For decades, the Japanese yen was the absolute definition of a safe haven currency, a bedrock of stability.
But currently, the yen has sunk to valuations we haven't seen since the mid-1980s. They have transitioned from being a powerhouse exporter of manufactured goods to an exporter of capital, holding $3.5 trillion in external assets.
But the immediate trigger for the collapse of the currency is the brutal mathematics of the global interest rate gap, the carry trade.
Explain the mechanics of the carry trade.
U.S. interest rates are sitting around 3.6%. The Bank of Japan, terrified of crushing their domestic economy, has kept their interest rates near rock bottom at just 1%.
So there's a massive 2.6% gap. Global money managers borrow massive amounts of yen at 1%, convert it to U.S. dollars, and buy U.S. Treasury bonds yielding 3.6%.
They pocket the difference. It is essentially free money. But millions of investors constantly selling yen to buy dollars acts like a massive gravitational pull, crashing the value of the yen. It is pure structural capital flight.
And the Japanese government attempted to fight back. The Ministry of Finance secretly authorized interventions, spending an estimated $72 billion of their foreign reserves to buy up yen.
And it failed. The yen continued to slide. A central bank from a G7 nation deployed $72 billion and was simply overwhelmed by the sheer, unregulated scale of global capital flows. The traditional institutions simply cannot control the tide anymore.
And finally, we see this vulnerability in the core democratic processes of Western nations, the UK and the desperate scramble to regulate political donations.
The analysis details a major legislative crackdown in the UK, directly triggered by the immense scrutiny surrounding Reform UK and Nigel Farage.
Specifically regarding the massive influx of donations originating from the cryptocurrency space and from figures like George Cottrell and Christopher Harborn.
The fear is the influx of dark money. Crypto wealth and offshore capital can easily be routed through shell companies to influence domestic elections.
So they are introducing a strict £100,000 cap on donations targeting individuals who have recently relocated to the UK and implementing deep corporate legitimacy checks.
It ties the entire narrative together perfectly. The World Bank abandoning climate goals, the Bank of Japan burning $72 billion and failing, the UK desperately building legislative firewalls against crypto wealth.
The traditional institutions are in full retreat. We have covered a truly massive amount of terrain today. We began by analyzing the breakdown of the foundational American myth, watching the global anchor transition into an unpredictable trickster,
Prompting allies and adversaries to actively diversify away from the old operating system.
We explored how that creates a power vacuum. Iran morphing into a military state, escalating conflicts that threaten European energy markets. Russia staring down dystopian scenarios with technocrats factoring nuclear escalation into their risk models.
We mapped the unprecedented rise of trillion-dollar Hawaiian corporations, pushing the boundaries of the AI arms race while accumulating systemic debt.
And we witnessed the deeply human cost. Gen Z Luddites desperately unplugging, the tragic scapegoating of migrants in South Africa, the chilling suppression of activists like Omar Khalid in India.
The diagnostic map is indeed broken. The great fragmentation is the harsh, mechanical operating reality of today.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to mull over as you step back out into this deeply fractured world. In a world where nation-states act increasingly like unpredictable individuals and massive tech corporations act increasingly like sovereign empires, Where does that leave you, the individual citizen?
It is the defining question.
When the boundaries of power completely blur, perhaps true sovereignty in the 21st century isn't about borders or corporate valuation at all. Perhaps in a world desperate to harvest your data and direct your anxiety, true sovereignty is simply about where you choose to place your attention.
A profound thought to end on.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Understanding these hidden forces is the only way to successfully navigate the muddy waters ahead. Stay curious, protect your attention, and we will see you on the next deep dive.